A few months ago, my girlfriend and I decided to take a hike through a trail in the woods. It was one of those days where the weather was perfect, not too hot, with the sun shining brightly but not too intensely. We'd been walking for hours, just taking it slow, enjoying the peace of the outdoors. The trail wound through the forest with trees towering above us, their leaves creating a soft rustling sound in the breeze. The kind of peace that made you feel removed from the world, where you could forget everything for a while and just focus on the steps ahead. We were deep into the trail, far enough that I didn't think we'd run into anyone else. There wasn't much sign of other hikers either, which made it feel even more remote. It was just us, the forest, and the occasional chirp of birds high in the trees. We hadn't seen any wildlife yet, other than a few birds and squirrels skittering through the trees, but I wasn't concerned. This was supposed to be a calming, relaxing hike. But as we made our way down the trail, I noticed a faint sound in the distance. It was a rustling in the brush to the left, and it was getting louder. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound seemed more deliberate, like something or someone moving through the undergrowth. My girlfriend, who had been walking a few paces ahead of me, must have heard it too. "I think it's a deer, babe," she whispered over her shoulder, her voice calm. I looked at her and then glanced around, trying to figure out what it could be. I couldn't see anything through the thick trees and underbrush, but whatever it was, it sounded big. Too big to be a deer. The noise was moving closer now, snapping branches and rustling leaves, and it was clear that whatever it wasn't trying to hide. My heart rate picked up. I'm no expert on wild animals, but I'd spent enough time outdoors to know that a deer wouldn't make that much noise. It was something else, something bigger, something much heavier. The sound grew louder, closer, and I felt my muscles tense up instinctively. I wasn't scared yet, but I could tell that something wasn't right. I was about to say something to her when I froze, staring down the trail in front of me. A giant black paw landed heavily on the dirt. It was unmistakable. I could feel my stomach drop as my brain quickly pieced together what I was seeing. A black bear, a huge one, and it was walking right toward us. Before I could react, my girlfriend screamed, "F-U-C-K!" Her voice was high-pitched, panic rising, and she was already running in the opposite direction before I could process what was happening. Her legs pumping in a blur, feet barely touching the ground as she tore off into the woods. I stood there, frozen for a split second, staring at the bear as it moved slowly, calmly toward the trail. Its fur was dark as night, its massive body looking like a shadow in the woods. Its eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, it was like time stopped. The bear didn't growl or roar. It didn't do anything aggressive. It just stared at me. I was maybe 10 yards away from it, and I could feel its gaze like it was piercing through me. I didn't know if it was sizing me up or if it was just curious, but I could see that it was massive. This was no small bear. This was a 300 to 350 pound beast, easily the size of a small car, with thick, muscular legs and claws that could tear through anything. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I had heard plenty of bear stories, how not to run, how to avoid startling them, how to make yourself look bigger. But none of that was going through my mind right now. All I could think was how close the bear was, how dangerous it could be, and how quickly I needed to move. But I didn't. I stayed there for a moment longer, rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on the bear. It wasn't charging, it wasn't attacking, it was just walking. Slowly, almost lazily, as if it didn't even care we were there. Its huge paws padded along the dirt trail, making barely any sound, like it owned the place. Then, without warning, I snapped out of my trance. My body finally caught up with my brain. I turned and started running, adrenaline hitting my bloodstream like a shot of pure energy. My legs moved faster than I thought they could, and I didn't even look back. I wasn't gonna stick around to see what happened. As I sprinted, I stole a quick glance behind me. I expected the bear to be chasing us, but instead, it was calmly crossing the trail, paying no attention to us at all. It wasn't running, it wasn't lunging after us. It just walked across the dirt path, one paw after another, like it had all the time in the world. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or even more terrified. Maybe the bear wasn't as interested in us as I thought, or maybe it just hadn't decided if we were a threat yet. But either way, it didn't matter. I wasn't waiting around to find out. I was gaining on my girlfriend now. She had veered off the trail into the woods, running like a maniac, her feet kicking up dirt as she plowed through the undergrowth. She wasn't paying attention to where she was going, and I could see she was getting farther from the trail with each step. I shouted for her to stop, but she was already in full panic mode, her breath coming in short gasps. She was so lost in fear that she hadn't even noticed that she was about to run right back into the bear's path. I reached her just as she was about to turn into an area thick with trees, a part of the woods where we couldn't see a thing. She was breathing hard, her face pale. She looked like she was about to collapse from sheer panic. We stopped and stared at each other for a second, both of us trying to catch our breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I knew we had to get out of there, fast. I pulled my backpack off and fumbled around inside. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely get a grip on my knife, but eventually, I pulled it free. It was just a small folding knife, not much, but it was something. I looked at my girlfriend, who was still wide-eyed, her face a mixture of shock and fear. "Let's go," I said, though it didn't really sound like me. My voice was tight, strained from the panic and adrenaline. We didn't wait any longer. We turned around and started running back toward the trail, our feet crashing through the brush as we picked our way through the undergrowth. We didn't look back. We didn't stop to breathe, to slow down, or to even think about what had just happened. We just ran. The trail felt like it took forever to reach, and my legs were starting to burn. But there was no way I was stopping now. We reached the clearing where we had parked our truck, and the relief was almost overwhelming. I could see the headlights in the distance, shining through the trees, waiting for us like a beacon. We didn't say anything as we climbed into the truck. Neither of us had the energy to speak. We both just stared straight ahead, breathing heavily, our chests still tight from the panic that gripped us. I started the engine and pulled away slowly, making sure to watch the rearview mirror for any sign of movement in the woods behind us. We didn't talk much the rest of the way back. There was just a quiet understanding between us, what had happened, how close we had come to something terrible. It didn't feel like a close call. It felt like we had just survived something that could have gone very differently. And for that, I was grateful. Looking back now, I can still feel the weight of those moments, the way time seemed to slow down when I saw that bear, the way everything felt so heavy in my chest. But we made it. We got out of there in one piece, and that's what mattered. We're both more careful now when we go hiking, more aware of our surroundings. Sometimes the woods feel peaceful, but you never know what could be lurking just out of sight. I live in the Black Hills, a place that's as beautiful as it is intimidating. Towering pines, rolling hills, and the endless expanse of rugged wilderness make it a perfect place for people who enjoy the outdoors. It's also home to mountain lions. Known by some as pumas or cougars, these big cats are a silent presence in the area, moving through the woods with an eerie grace. I've spent a lot of time hiking, camping, and exploring these hills, but there's always that lingering awareness of the predators that roam these lands. I suppose you get used to it, or at least that's what I tell myself. One weekend, my now husband, Jake, and I decided to go camping. It had been a while since we had a real getaway, just the two of us, so we thought it would be nice to head out into the woods. We invited our friend Tim along, who was definitely not an outdoorsman. Tim liked the idea of camping, but only if there were enough amenities to keep him comfortable. He wasn't a hiker, didn't have much experience with camping gear, and most importantly, he didn't know how to handle himself in the woods. We set up camp by a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. It was a peaceful spot, away from the usual crowds of tourists and campers. The air was crisp, the smell of pine filled the air, and the only sound was the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. Tim spent most of the afternoon lounging around the fire, sipping on beers, and trying to convince Jake and me that he could totally handle roughing it. I'd been camping in these woods enough times to know that when it came to camping, Tim's version of roughing it meant a fancy chair by the fire and a cooler full of snacks. The first night went off without a hitch. We had a great time cooking over the fire, telling stories, and just enjoying the quiet of the wilderness. As the sun set and the stars began to fill the sky, we settled into our tent. I'd set up my sleeping bag and was already half asleep when I heard Tim mumble something about not feeling so great. He'd had more than a few drinks, so I figured he was just a little too tipsy. But then, in the middle of the night, I woke up to hear him getting sick outside the tent. It was dark, and the sound of Tim retching echoed through the woods. At first, I thought it was just the result of too much alcohol, but the more I listened, the more I realized something felt off. There was a sort of heaviness to the air, a stillness that didn't sit right with me. I tried to shake it off, but it wasn't long before I heard it. Rustling. Not the wind, not the usual movement of animals through the underbrush, but something deliberate, something bigger. I turned to Jake, who was already awake. He had heard it too. "I'll take him back to the truck," Jake whispered, his voice steady but low. "You stay here. I'll be back as quick as I can." I hesitated. There were too many things about this situation that didn't feel right. The rustling was louder now, and it wasn't just the sound of small animals scavenging for food. I was sure of it. I nodded reluctantly, though the unease creeping up my spine told me I wasn't comfortable with the idea of being alone in the middle of the night. Jake packed up some essentials, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, and his jacket, and then he left, guiding Tim down the trail towards the truck. I stayed in the tent, alone. It didn't take long before I regretted my decision. The first few minutes were fine, just the sound of the fire crackling outside and the soft wind pushing through the trees. But then it came again, the rustling closer this time. I could hear it moving behind the tent, just out of view. I grabbed my hatchet, which was tucked in the corner of the tent, and the small multi-tool I always kept on me. My fingers were cold, and despite myself, my breathing had quickened. I grabbed the flashlight and flicked it on, scanning the dark trees outside the tent. Nothing. The beam of light only revealed the shadows of the pines, the occasional flicker of a branch moving in the wind, but nothing that looked dangerous. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the weight of the sounds, the deliberate steps, kept me on edge. I sat there, straining my ears, listening. The rustling stopped, only to be replaced by low, guttural grunts. Something was moving in the brush, moving slowly and methodically, as if it was circling the camp. My heart raced and I gripped the hatchet tighter. I could hear it now, the sounds of heavy breathing and faint movement, almost like something stalking, testing the air. Then I heard it, the scream of a cat, the kind of scream that stops your heart, that makes your skin crawl. A mountain lion, unmistakably. The sound sliced through the night, echoing across the clearing. My throat went dry, and I froze. I'd heard mountain lions scream before, but never this close, never this loud. I had always known they were out there, but hearing one so near, knowing it was close enough to be on the hunt, made every instinct in my body scream to get out. But there was no way I was going to leave the tent now. I could only wait. The minutes dragged on, each one stretching longer than the last. My mind raced, trying to come up with any logical explanation for what was happening. Maybe the mountain lion had caught a deer, maybe it was just passing through. But everything in me told me it wasn't that simple. The way it had moved, the way it had paused, it felt deliberate, like it knew I was there. I kept the flashlight in my hand, shining it out of the tent every few minutes, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever it was that had been circling. But the trees were too thick and the shadows too deep. I could hear the grunts again, closer this time. They sounded almost human, like a low growl mixed with a grunt, a sound I'd never heard from any animal I'd known. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. The thought of a mountain lion moving around my tent, so close, was enough to make my stomach churn. I kept telling myself that I was being paranoid, that the cat had long since moved on. But I knew it wasn't true. It was still out there, and it wasn't going anywhere. The minutes felt like hours. I finally heard the sound of footsteps again, but this time it was unmistakable. There was a shift in the air, the faintest brush of leaves against fur, and the grunt that followed was low and ominous. It was so close that I could almost feel the heat of its body through the fabric of the tent. I held my breath, my eyes wide and unblinking. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to call Jake. But of course, the service was non-existent. My only options were the hatchet and the flashlight. Neither seemed like much against a predator that weighed hundreds of pounds. I strained my ears, listening for any sound of movement that would indicate the lion was moving away. But instead, the grunt grew louder, deeper, more urgent, as though the cat was testing its prey, weighing its options. It was a chilling, primal sound that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, there was a crack. A branch snapped in the underbrush, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy paws patting softly on the earth. I couldn't help it. I gasped. My breath came in sharp, panicked bursts. Just then, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching quickly from the path. Jake, my heart almost stopped from relief. He burst into the clearing, flashlight scanning the area in all directions. Tim was still with him, looking pale and disoriented. Jake scanned the area quickly and, without missing a beat, ushered me out of the tent, pulling me towards the truck. "Let's go," Jake said, his voice calm but with an edge of urgency. "Now." We didn't stop running until we were safely back at the truck. Tim slumped in the passenger seat. I glanced back at the camp one last time, my heart still racing. The Black Hills were beautiful, yes, but they were also home to things I wasn't ready to face alone. As we drove back down the winding trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, just beyond the trees, watching. The day had started like any other backpacking trip into the backcountry. Quiet, peaceful, just me and the wild. The kind of silence that surrounds you out here, far away from civilization, can be overwhelming at times. The wind whispered through the trees, the occasional splash of water from birds diving into the lake, and the soft crunch of my boots on the dirt path. Everything felt normal, as it should be, miles deep in the woods, just me and nature. The kind of place where no one would find you unless they were specifically looking. I had been following the trail for hours, pushing through dense forest, trying to get closer to the lake I had read about in the guidebook. The water was supposed to be pristine, a quiet retreat. I needed to refill my water bottle, and the path had started to drop down to the edge of the lake, the incline steep but manageable. I made my way down the slippery bank, the ground soft beneath my boots as I reached the water. The lake stretched out in front of me, the early evening sun glinting off the surface. I bent down and cupped my hands, filling my bottle with water, the coolness of it refreshing against my dry lips. I took a deep breath, savoring the stillness. This was why I came out here, peace. Just a few days to myself, no distractions, no noise. It had been a few months since I had been able to really get away, to lose myself in the wild. As I stood back up, I turned around to begin the climb back to the trail, but I froze. At first, I thought I might be imagining things, my mind playing tricks on me after hours of solitude. But there, just ahead, near the top of the bank, was a figure. A large man, standing still, wearing a camouflage jacket that blended perfectly with the surroundings. His stance was rigid, his gaze focused directly on me. He didn't move, but I could feel him watching me, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Then I saw it, a glint of metal in his hand, a handgun. My stomach dropped. The realization hit me hard, the heavy weight of the situation crashing down. He hadn't seen me coming, or if he had, he didn't expect me to be where I was. It wasn't just the sight of him, but the sudden awareness that I had walked straight into someone's territory. My heart began to race as I instinctively raised my hands, palms open in a gesture of surrender. I could feel the cold sweat on my neck, the kind of sweat that isn't from the heat, but from the very real fear that grips you when you realize something dangerous is happening. The man's eyes didn't leave me. He didn't move for a long time, and I didn't move either, afraid that even the slightest wrong gesture might make things worse. Then, slowly, his grip on the gun loosened, and he lowered it slightly, still keeping it pointed in my general direction but not at my chest anymore. He spoke, but I didn't catch what he said. The words were muffled, like they came from a distance. "Thought you were a cougar," he said, his voice low and raspy. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. A cougar? What was he talking about? He didn't wait for a response before continuing, his tone shifting to something more anxious, more paranoid. "Where you been? What trail you come from?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as if trying to size me up, trying to figure out if I was a threat. His gaze flickered over me, scanning, like I wasn't just a woman in the woods, but something more dangerous, something to be feared. The way he asked the questions made me feel like I was being interrogated. I didn't answer at first, couldn't. My mind was scrambling, trying to piece together the situation, trying to figure out what kind of person I was dealing with. There was something about the way he stood there, his clothes, his hand near the gun, the way his eyes darted around the woods as though checking for something, someone, that set off alarms in my head. His eyes darted nervously between me and the trees, as though he were constantly looking over his shoulder. "You came alone?" he asked next, and I realized the suspicion in his voice had nothing to do with me. It had everything to do with what I might have stumbled into. I was alone. I had come here to be alone, to escape everything for a while. But the moment he asked about my being alone, my stomach turned. Was he just being cautious? Or was he hiding something? Something out here, far from civilization, deep in the woods? My gut told me it was the latter. His constant shifting gaze, the way his hand twitched near the gun, it all felt wrong. He started asking more questions, rapid fire, like he wasn't really listening for answers but trying to figure out if I knew something. "You seen anyone else out here?" He shifted again, moving slightly to one side, then back, his hand still close to the gun. It was like he was trying to hide something, to keep whatever it was from being discovered. I could feel it now, a growing tension in the air, something I couldn't put my finger on. I glanced around the trees, hoping to spot something, anything, that might explain his odd behavior. But all I saw was the dense forest stretching out in every direction. It didn't take long before I realized the truth. There was something about him that didn't add up. The way he was so on edge, the constant questions, the way he kept looking around like he was expecting someone to show up at any moment. I tried to keep my voice steady, replying that I hadn't seen anyone, that I had just been following the trail. My words sounded hollow in my own ears. What did he want? What was he so afraid of? I stood there, my heart pounding, trying to read his face, to figure out what he was thinking. But I couldn't. The longer I stood there, the more uncomfortable I became, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. His posture softened just a little, but his eyes remained sharp, like he was still waiting for something. He didn't say much after that, just gave me one last look before turning and disappearing into the trees. I stood there for a long time, frozen, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. What had I just encountered? A paranoid man in the woods with a gun, asking questions, watching me like I was some kind of intruder. I didn't wait around to find out more. My instincts screamed at me to move, to get away from him before whatever situation he was in escalated. I turned and made my way back up the bank, scrambling to reach the trail and put as much distance between myself and that man as I could. My heart was still racing, my hands clammy, but I kept walking, my eyes darting nervously over my shoulder. After a while, I began to calm down. Maybe he was just a hunter, someone who had wandered too far into the backcountry, lost in his own paranoia. Maybe there was no pot farm, no illegal operation out there. But the more I thought about it, the less convinced I was of that. There was something off about him, something I couldn't ignore. The rest of my hike was uneventful, and I eventually reached my next campsite, setting up quickly and trying to push the encounter out of my mind. But I never forgot the way he had looked at me, the way his eyes had searched mine, and the way he had been so quick to lower the gun after thinking I was a cougar. What if he wasn't just some paranoid man lost in the woods? What if he was hiding something darker out there? The questions lingered in my mind long after I left the woods, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something dangerous. The feeling stayed with me, even long after I returned home, safe and sound. Something about that encounter didn't sit right, and it took a while before I could shake the uneasy sense of being watched. And then there was the cougar. It wasn't a coincidence, not at all. I had been stalked. The signs were there, the feeling of being watched, the way the hair on the back of my neck had stood up when I thought I saw something moving in the trees behind me. It wasn't just the man with the gun that had made my heart race. There had been something else, something following me from the shadows. It's a strange feeling, knowing you're being stalked, knowing that someone wants to make you their prey. You don't see it at first, but you feel it. You feel the eyes on you, the silent presence lurking in the dark. And it makes you realize that, in the wild, you are never truly alone. I never went back to that part of the woods. Something told me it was best to leave the mystery unsolved, to let the forest keep its secrets. But I'll always remember that day, and I'll always remember the way it felt to be watched. I remember that weekend like it was yesterday, though it was years ago. The memory of it is etched in my mind, and even now, when I close my eyes, I can still feel the discomfort, the unease, the way the daylight had this strange, gray quality, like everything was drenched in fog, even though there was none. I had been out in the woods, exploring a part of the country that had been largely forgotten by time. It was the sort of place where nothing modern was left untouched by the ravages of history. Even the air felt thick with the past, as though the echoes of long-forgotten lives hung around every tree and every stone. The area was dotted with remnants of old Civil War-era buildings, slowly crumbling into oblivion. Rusted iron beams, shattered bricks, and splintered wood. Once, these structures had been full of life. Now, they stood as silent monuments to lives lived in isolation, to lives that had probably been full of desperation and madness. You can imagine how it felt walking around in those woods. The kind of woods where your footsteps echoed off walls that had once been home to families. Families who had probably fought and bled just to survive in those miserable hills. I had read about the folklore surrounding these places. Stories of men driven mad by the solitude, the long winters, the unyielding hardships of farm life during that time. people who snapped and did things no one should ever do. The stories said that some had even killed their own children or their wives. And when I walked among the ruins of those places, I didn't know if it was my imagination or if it was something deeper, something instinctive, but it made my skin crawl. It felt like the ghosts of those who had gone mad were still lingering there. There was one farmhouse that particularly stood out to me. It wasn't large, but it had a presence to it. An old, two-story structure, the kind of place you could imagine as a family's home, surrounded by a small field that had long since been overgrown. I couldn't help but notice the piles of deer bones near what looked like a mattress. The mattress was stained with something dark, probably blood, and there were bits of broken furniture scattered about, as though someone had just given up on living there. Old bottles of liquor lay scattered, their foul contents long since evaporated. Leather straps had been nailed into the walls, worn and weathered by time, but still holding onto the memory of their use. It looked as though whoever had lived there had been scraping by for years, barely hanging on to whatever semblance of a life they had left. As I stepped deeper into the house, I felt my foot catch on something sharp. Looking down, I saw a rusted blade sticking out from a pile of debris. Just a few inches away, there were more blades, all with jagged edges. The kind of thing that could easily tear into your skin and, worse, leave you with a fatal dose of tetanus if you weren't careful. That's the thing about these old places, they were riddled with dangers like that. No one had bothered to clean them up, and no one had cared enough to make them safe. A few feet inside the door, I spotted a black widow spider sitting in the corner. It wasn't the kind of thing you could easily ignore, especially not when you're already on edge. And I had barely stepped into the house, just a few seconds, and I was already finding dangers like that. I left quickly, my boots crunching over the dried leaves outside. It wasn't hard to imagine that the people who had lived there had long since gone mad. The isolation, the lack of anything resembling community, the slow, painful erosion of sanity. These things would do it to a person. And those stories about men killing their families? It was easy to see how they might be true. No one ever talked about the people who lived here anymore. But I knew deep down that they had been real, that they had existed, and they had probably met a tragic end out here in the middle of nowhere. My legs carried me away from that place, but the image of the ruined house stuck with me. I knew I couldn't shake it off. It was one of those things that stayed with you, like a smell that clings to your clothes. I walked deeper into the woods, passing by more of those shacks and huts, the remnants of whatever fleeting existence people had carved out of the land. Each structure was a little more disheveled than the last. Tin roofs, rusted nails, the stench of old beer cans and cigarette butts that had been scattered everywhere. Their presence a testament to the people who had lived here. But these weren't homes. Not really. They were shelters, temporary things meant for escape. Whoever had built them had been running from something. Maybe they were hunters or outlaws. Maybe they were people who had just wanted to get away from society for good. Or maybe they were families who had gotten lost in the vastness of the land. Whatever the case, they were all alone. And as I walked through the woods, I realized something. These places, these so-called homes, were all designed to isolate people from the world. And once someone had chosen that kind of life, they couldn't come back. There was no way out. The farther I walked, the more these abandoned places began to disturb me. There was something unsettling about them. More than just the decay, more than the knowledge that people had lived and died in these places. It was the realization that they had all been built out of desperation. Some of these shelters had been hastily thrown together with sheet metal, a few 2x4s, and a single mattress, still fairly new but surrounded by trash. Empty beer cans, cigarette butts, and .22 caliber shells were scattered about. Who had built these, and why? What had driven them to live like this? It became clear to me that no one came here by accident. You didn't end up in these woods unless you had a reason to be here. Maybe you were running from something, or maybe you were just too broken to care anymore. Either way, the longer I stayed, the more I realized that the woods were full of people who had been lost to time, living on the fringes of society. They weren't criminals or outcasts necessarily. They were just people who had gotten too far away from everything to ever return. I hadn't planned to stay out there long, but as I wandered deeper into the forest, something changed. It wasn't the landscape or the history that began to disturb me. It was the growing sense of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a tightness settled in my chest. I wasn't alone anymore. That much was certain. I'd always thought of the woods as a place of peace, a place where you could lose yourself. But now, it felt like a place of tension, of pressure, as though something was waiting for me to make a mistake. It wasn't an animal or a person, but something else, something older. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, one that gnawed at me as I kept walking, my mind racing with all the stories I'd heard about hermits and loners, about people who spent years in the woods, slowly losing their grip on reality. I turned back after a while, but by the time I retraced my steps, the light had begun to fade. It wasn't full darkness yet, but the sky was gray, almost unnatural, as though the day itself had been bled of its color. That feeling of being watched intensified, and I found myself looking over my shoulder every few steps. The woods didn't feel like they were meant to be explored anymore. They felt like a place that had been forgotten, abandoned by everyone except those who had been driven to it by some force outside of their control. As I made my way back to the main trail, I spotted a structure up ahead. It was just another shack like the others I had seen, but something about it caught my attention. It wasn't just the way it was built or the worn-out look of it. It was the fact that the door was ajar. That wasn't normal. These shacks had been abandoned, left to rot, but this one was different. Someone had been there recently. I could tell because the door was still half open, and there was fresh dirt near the threshold. I knew I shouldn't go closer. I should have just turned around, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked cautiously toward it, keeping an eye out for any signs of life, anything that could explain why the door was open. As I neared it, I heard a noise, a soft, faint scraping sound, like something being dragged across the ground. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I was alone, and there was no one around for miles. Then I heard it again, louder this time. It was coming from inside the shack. My breath hitched in my throat as I stood there, unsure of what to do. I could feel the tension building inside me, like a pressure that was slowly choking me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I made my decision. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I didn't even look back. The woods were still behind me, full of the mysteries I would never understand. Camping at Lanochi was supposed to be the perfect Boy Scout outing. It was one of those camps that everyone talked about, the kind of place where you learned real skills, got dirty, and bonded with your patrol. That year, we were staying in the large canvas tents at one of the more remote sites. There was a small creek nearby and enough trees to make the whole place feel like we were really out in the woods. We set up our cots, unloaded our gear, and settled in for what was supposed to be a peaceful night under the stars. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, and the campfire's glow was a faint memory. It was the kind of night where the air felt thick, cool, and still. The other guys in my patrol were already fast asleep, the slow, rhythmic sound of their breathing filling the tent. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest. I had that familiar, sinking feeling, like something was just off. I lay on my cot, staring up at the tent's canvas roof, straining to listen to the sounds of the forest around us. The crickets, the rustling of leaves in the trees, and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. Everything seemed normal, yet everything seemed too quiet at the same time. It was as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard it. A faint sound at first, a rustle, just a shift of the tent, nothing too loud. My heart immediately jumped, and I held my breath, straining to make sense of what it was. It wasn't the wind. The air was still. It wasn't an animal either, at least not the typical animals we'd expected around camp, like raccoons or squirrels. This was something else. Something deliberate. The noise came again, this time closer. Soft, almost muffled. A footstep? No, something had definitely entered the tent. I could feel my pulse quicken. My brain was screaming at me to look, to move, to do something, but my body felt paralyzed, frozen in place. It was as if I couldn't move even if I wanted to. I opened my mouth to whisper to the guy sleeping next to me, hoping to make sense of it with someone else's perspective. But the words wouldn't come. My throat was dry, and I was suddenly terrified that if I said anything out loud, I would make whatever it was aware that I was awake. I shifted slightly, just enough to make out the shape of my patrol mate lying on his cot beside me. He didn't stir. No response. Was I just imagining it? Was this some late-night paranoia kicking in? Couldn't tell. The noises continued, now coming from directly next to my cot. Someone was right there. I could hear faint rustling as it shuffled in the darkness. I forced myself to stay still, praying that whatever it was would just leave. The sound seemed to pause for a moment. I dared not look over. My mind raced, desperately trying to explain away what I was hearing. Maybe it was the wind tugging at the canvas. Maybe some animal had gotten inside. But no, this felt too intentional, too calculated. Seconds ticked by, or maybe it was minutes. Time seemed to stretch in a way that only happens when you're absolutely terrified. The sound of something moving next to me ceased, and I held my breath. The absence of sound felt as suffocating as the noise had been. I waited for what felt like an eternity, listening intently for any signs of movement. Finally, there was a soft shuffle, then silence. Whatever had entered the tent was gone. It had slipped out just as quietly as it had come in. I still couldn't make myself move, but I couldn't stay awake either. My eyelids grew heavy, and my exhaustion finally won out. I fell asleep with my mind still racing, trying to make sense of everything. Morning came too soon. I woke up groggy, disoriented, and with that uneasy feeling still crawling up my spine. The light creeping into the tent through the canvas seemed almost too bright, too welcoming after the tension of the night. I tried to shake off the dread that lingered, but something was definitely off. I forced myself out of bed and stretched, trying to act normal. I was trying to convince myself that I had just imagined it all. The forest was full of noises, after all. Maybe it had been a deer or the wind or maybe even a raccoon. But when I stepped outside, I saw it. My trunk, which I had packed just the day before, was wide open. My heart sank. I walked over to it, dread creeping up my back. Inside, everything looked disheveled. Clothes had been pulled out, and some of my gear had been shifted around. But it was the empty bag of Jack Link's beef jerky and the empty wrapper of juicy fruit gum that really made my stomach drop. Those were things I knew I had left packed away in my bag the night before. I froze. The realization hit me like a cold slap. Last night's rustling, the movements in the tent, hadn't been a ghost or my imagination. It had been an animal, a raccoon or possibly more. They had gotten into my trunk, torn open the snacks, and probably made their way through the camp. But I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel better knowing that it was just a bunch of raccoons. The thought of those things, of anything, creeping around our camp in the dead of night, coming into our tent, feeling so close, had me feeling deeply unsettled. It was the kind of thing that you didn't talk about right away, especially not in front of the others, who were just waking up and beginning to make their way out of the tents. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't need to. The mess outside my trunk, the gnaw marks, the chewed up bags. It was enough of a clue for everyone else to piece together. As I stood there in the growing light of morning, my mind replayed last night's events over and over. It wasn't just the fact that the animals had gotten into my stuff. It was the feeling of being watched, of being aware of something lurking just beyond the edge of my senses. And in the back of my mind, I knew it wasn't just the raccoons that had been out there that night. It had been too quiet, too purposeful, too eerie. There had been something in the air, something unsettling in the way the forest had held its breath right alongside me. But as the day unfolded and the other scouts gathered around the campfire to tell stories and laugh, the feeling faded into the background. Everyone seemed too preoccupied with their own thoughts, too busy being scouts to notice. And as we broke camp that afternoon, packing up our tents, I tried my hardest to push the memories from that night to the back of my mind. But I knew deep down that some things stay with you. Some experiences don't just fade away, no matter how hard you try to forget them. And whatever had crept into our tent that night, whatever had rifled through my gear, it wasn't something I'd ever be able to fully explain. All I could do was shake my head and laugh it off when anyone asked about the strange noises from the night before. But the truth was, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods at Lanochi held secrets. Secrets that would always stay just out of reach. And sometimes that was the scariest part of all. I spent a few weeks each summer at a camp in South Carolina when I was a kid. It was one of those old school camps with cabins, hiking, and all the stuff you'd expect from a place trying to make you feel one with nature. I wasn't particularly into the whole roughing it thing, but I did like some of the activities. Guns, archery, swimming, and karate were the fun parts for me. But the rest of it, not so much. It was just a lot of bugs, dirt, and sitting around the campfire listening to ghost stories from counselors who took their jobs way too seriously. One year, when I was maybe 11 or 12, the counselors decided that our cabin, and one or two others, would go on a camping trip. The spot they picked was about a mile or so down the road from the camp. It was past a small church, then down a little dirt road until you reached a large clearing in the woods. The place was pretty isolated, but at least it was relatively safe, or so they thought. It wasn't like we were out in some wilderness where you could get lost and eaten by something, at least not on the surface. The campfires were lit up by the creek, where we set up our tents and sleeping bags. We camped near the creek, away from the open field where the tree stood. There was this large single tree in the middle of that field, standing like some kind of lonely sentinel in the dark. The firelight barely made it past the clearing, and beyond that, the woods swallowed everything up. The counselors made sure everyone had flashlights and lanterns, but once it got dark, you realized how far the light didn't reach. The kids at the camp weren't your typical wilderness experts. Most of us came from suburban or city backgrounds, and we had no idea what the real woods were like after dark. We were just kids out there to have fun and cause trouble. As usual, the counselors made the rules clear. No cursing, no fighting, no stealing, and no ignoring them. They seemed to think we were all little devils ready to tear the place apart the minute their backs were turned. So, they set up this strange rule for the camping trip. If you did something wrong after dark, you'd have to walk out to the tree. At first, I didn't think much of it. I mean, it was just a tree, right? How bad could it be? But as the sun sank below the horizon, the mood shifted. The warmth from the fire felt like it was getting smaller, and the air turned colder. I stood on the edge of the clearing, staring at that tree. The grass was only knee-high, but it stretched out toward the tree in a way that made it seem farther than it really was. Maybe it was just the darkness, but that tree seemed more imposing the longer I looked at it. The forest beyond it looked even worse. I remember thinking it was weird, but not that weird. I mean, it was just a tree, but something about the way the dark closed in around it, the way the shadows started to twist under the low light, gave me an uneasy feeling. And then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Pairs of yellow eyes blinking from the edge of the forest. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But no, there were too many of them. It was like staring into the deep, glowing pits of the forest, each pair of eyes reflecting back at me like some kind of warning. I couldn't make out any shapes, but I knew they weren't just bugs or some harmless creatures. They were too low to the ground, about waist height to man height, and that scared the hell out of me. Big animals, large ones. The eyes didn't blink in unison. They moved around, side to side, shifting positions almost like they were tracking me. My stomach dropped, but for some reason, I couldn't look away. The only thing I knew was that I had to walk to that tree. The stupid rule was stuck in my head, pushing me to move, to follow through. Maybe it was peer pressure, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't scared. But whatever it was, it took over. I took a step forward. I didn't think much of it at first. The firelight still gave me confidence, and at 80 feet away from the tree, I could still see clearly. But as I got closer, everything changed. At 60 feet, the light from the fire started to fade. The darkness crept in like a wet blanket, and I could barely make out anything ahead of me. The ground felt soft beneath my feet, the grass brushing against my legs, but I couldn't see it anymore. I couldn't see my hands, couldn't even see the ground at my feet. It felt like the whole world was closing in on me, and those damn eyes were still watching. To 40 feet, my breathing started to pick up. I felt my chest tighten, my body go cold. I had to keep moving, I told myself. Just touch the tree and come back. But the closer I got, the more the silence weighed down on me. No crickets, no wind in the trees, nothing. Just the pounding of my own heart and the feeling that something was wrong. The eyes were still out there, shifting and following me with that eerie, unblinking stare. 30 feet, I froze. I had no idea why I stopped, but I just did. I could feel my knees shaking, my teeth chattering. I was scared. I don't know if I was scared of what I saw or what I didn't see, but the dread was unbearable. I knew I had to get to the tree, but I also knew I didn't want to. The further I got, the closer the forest seemed to creep up to the tree, and the more I realized that I wasn't alone. I wasn't just walking toward the tree. I was walking toward something, and those eyes were all around me, out of sight but too close. I started to imagine the worst. Wolves, bears, whatever it was, I felt like it could move faster than I could. I could sense it, feel it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I thought about how vulnerable I was, alone in the dark, with nothing but a tree between me and whatever was lurking in the woods. Every movement in the grass, every little shift in the air made me tense up even more. I couldn't hear anything but my breathing and the sound of my own heartbeat thudding in my chest. I stood there for what felt like hours. I knew I had to just touch the tree and get back to the fire, but something deep down told me that if I ran toward the tree, I wouldn't make it back. Something would be waiting. I couldn't move. I could hear the grass around me, rustling under something heavy, something that wasn't human. It was too quiet, too still, except for the shifting eyes and the soft, almost imperceptible sounds in the underbrush. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. The dread was too much. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. When I finally broke, I didn't just walk back to the fire. I ran. I ran like I've never run before. My feet hit the ground like a stampede, kicking up dirt and grass as I bolted toward the firelight. I didn't look back. Couldn't. I just focused on the orange glow of the flames and ran straight for it, faster than I thought possible. I swear I could feel something behind me, something big, moving in the grass, crashing through the underbrush. The sound of paws, heavy and fast, pushing through the grass like it was coming after me. But I didn't stop, couldn't. Every step felt like a race against whatever was closing in behind me. I didn't look back until I was at the fire, and even then, I didn't see anything. But I knew The counselors and other kids were staring at me, and I could barely catch my breath. I don't think anyone understood what had just happened. Maybe they thought I was just freaked out over the dark. Maybe they thought I was being dramatic. But I knew. I felt it. Those eyes, the creatures, whatever they were real. And they were watching me. I never found out what was out there that night. The next day, we packed up and went back to the main camp, and no one spoke about it. The tree stood out there in the clearing, untouched, but I never saw it the same way again. South Carolina, with its thick woods and thick dark, had something lurking in it, and I knew, deep down, that whatever those eyes were, they'd always be out there, waiting. It was the summer when I was 13, and our family took a road trip up the west coast to Oregon. It was one of those spontaneous trips. Nothing planned too far in advance, just a long drive to see the sights, stretch our legs, and let the days unfold however they wanted. We didn't have any particular destination in mind, but we ended up stopping at a beach just past Newport. It was a gray, foggy day, which was typical for the Oregon coast, and we didn't mind. The mist was thick, almost like the ocean itself had decided to rise up and swallow the land whole. We piled out of the car and made our way down to the shore. The beach was almost completely empty, save for a few scattered tourists, probably not sticking around for long with the fog rolling in like that. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks was hypnotic, a constant, rhythmic boom that almost drowned out the wind. The sand beneath my feet was cold and damp, the air salty and sharp. My parents stayed close to the car, unpacking a picnic, while I drifted off on my own, enjoying the solitude. There was something peaceful about walking alone on a beach with the fog so thick that it felt like the world had been reduced to just you, the ocean, and the air. I could barely make out the silhouettes of my family behind me. As I walked farther down the shore, my curiosity took over. The beach wasn't exactly flat. It was littered with rocks and odd bits of driftwood, like nature had just thrown its garbage into the sea and let it wash up here. The sand was churned up, and every few steps, I'd kick a stray stick or piece of driftwood out of the way. I didn't mind the fog. If anything, it felt like it added to the mystery of the beach, like I was walking through an old dream. Eventually, I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye. I was getting farther from the main stretch of beach, and there, just off to the side, was a little lagoon. It was more like a massive tide pool, the water dark and slick with seaweed. I figured it must have been formed from the ocean moving in and out, carving out a small pocket in the sand. I stopped for a second, watching the water lap gently at the edge of the lagoon. The fog was thick around me now, the air colder, and I hugged my jacket tighter around me. I started walking around the outside of the lagoon, taking care not to slip on the wet rocks scattered along the shore. It wasn't until I got about halfway around that I saw something strange, sticks sticking up out of the sand in random spots. At first, I thought they were just more pieces of driftwood, like the kind that's scattered all over the beach. But then I realized something wasn't right. The sticks weren't just lying there, they were standing up, shoved deep into the sand. And not just a few of them, there were a whole bunch, all pointed in different directions. I stepped closer, intrigued but also feeling a little uneasy. People do weird things on beaches, especially in Oregon. Some tourists build little huts or shacks with driftwood, but this wasn't anything like that. I crouched down, trying to get a better look, and that's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. The sticks weren't just sticks anymore. They were pikes poking out of the sand, and they weren't empty. Something was attached to the top of each one. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at, but then it clicked, and I felt my stomach drop. Animal heads, real animal heads with the bodies nowhere in sight. Each head was shoved onto the end of a stick, like some twisted trophy display. The first one I noticed was a pelican, its beak long and sharp, eyes wide open in a permanent stare. The feathers were disheveled, like the bird had been dead for days. Another stick had the head of a seagull, its beady eyes frozen in a glassy stare. And then I saw it. A seal, its round eyes still eerily intact, its face frozen in what looked like an agonized expression. The seal's head was much larger than the others, its weight dragging the stick down so it almost touched the ground. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, processing what I was seeing. The fog around me seemed to thicken, the world shrinking down to just this little patch of beach. I could feel the chill creeping into my bones, and I felt nauseous. Why would someone do this? Who would do this? I stepped back, but as I did, my eyes caught more details. At first, I thought the sticks were just scattered around, but now I saw that they were arranged in a sort of pattern. Some were positioned in a semicircle, others jutting out at odd angles, forming an unnatural boundary around the lagoon. There were other carcasses, too. Dead seagulls, a couple of pelicans, all of them scattered across the sand like some kind of grotesque offering. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, but my feet felt frozen in place, my legs weak, like they couldn't move fast enough. I tried to think of any reason this could be happening. Maybe it was some sort of art project, maybe a bizarre local custom, but nothing made sense. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the fog was so thick now that it felt like the world was closing in on me. I couldn't stand it any longer. I turned and started walking as fast as I could back toward my family, the fog swirling around me like it was alive, thickening the farther I went. I didn't look back, afraid of what I might see if I did. I just focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on getting back to my family, where I would be safe. As I reached the edge of the beach, I spotted my parents and brother still by the car, setting up a blanket. I could tell they hadn't noticed me gone for long, and I didn't plan on telling them what I had found. Not yet. I didn't want to freak them out or make them think I was imagining things. But I couldn't shake the image of those animal heads on the sticks, staring out at the ocean, their dead eyes frozen forever in the mist. We didn't stay much longer after that. My parents packed up the picnic and we left the beach, the fog still hanging heavy in the air as we drove away. I didn't say anything about what I'd seen, but I could tell my mind was racing. What had I stumbled upon? Why were the animal heads there? Who had done this and why? I've never gone back to that beach. In fact, I haven't gone back to any beach on the Oregon coast since. The memory of that place, the fog, the eerie silence, the dead animals, haunts me. It feels like a warning, like I had walked too close to something I wasn't supposed to see. I can still picture it so clearly in my mind. The lagoon, the sticks sticking up from the sand, the twisted remains of the animals. I don't know what kind of person could do something like that, but I don't want to know. It's a memory I don't ever want to relive. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm on a beach walking alone. The fog always reminds me of that day, of that place, and the feeling that I was never supposed to see what I saw. Maybe it was just some sick, twisted prank, or maybe it was something more, something darker, something that shouldn't have been left out there for anyone to find. I'll never know for sure, but I've learned one thing. There are some things you're better off not knowing, and sometimes it's best to just keep walking and pretend you never saw them. That night still haunts me. I was in middle school, probably 12 or 13 at the time. My best friend and I had been excited about this camping trip for weeks. It was a summer camp with other kids our age, and we were both looking forward to the freedom that came with being away from home. The campsite was small, set up on a patch of flat land surrounded by trees, not far from a road. You could hear the occasional car driving by, but that night it was quiet, like most of the cars had already gone home for the day. We were sleeping in a platform tent, the kind of tent that sits above the ground with a wooden frame and mesh sides. The floor had a layer of thick canvas, which was pretty comfortable to sleep on. My friend and I had claimed the far side of the tent, closest to the edge of the woods, while the group leaders were a bit farther across the campsite in their own platform tent. It felt like a safe distance, but that would change by the middle of the night. The evening had been spent doing the usual camp activities, campfire songs, some hiking, and a bit of stargazing. After a few hours of talking, we finally crawled into our sleeping bags, settling in for what we thought would be a typical night under the stars. We were both a bit nervous, but it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. It was dark, but we weren't scared, at least not until it happened. I woke up at some point well after midnight. I wasn't sure exactly what had pulled me out of my sleep, but I could feel that something wasn't right. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I tried to shake off the grogginess of sleep. It was quiet, except for the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of a car driving by on the road. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a human figure standing between the trees. The figure was still just standing there, watching us. I could see the outline of a person, but they were too far away to make out any details. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a tightness in my throat. I wasn't sure if it was real or if I was just seeing things, but then I noticed my friend stirring beside me. I didn't make a sound, but she must have felt the same eerie sensation because, without saying anything, she slowly opened her eyes. She must have seen what I saw because she froze, and I could feel her hand reaching for mine in the dark. The connection was instant, like we both knew something was terribly wrong. We didn't speak, but our hands found each other, gripping tightly, silently acknowledging the terror we were both feeling. The figure stayed in place for what felt like forever. I couldn't tell what it was doing, but it didn't seem like it was going anywhere. I was too scared to breathe too loudly, worried that it might hear me and get closer. The wind had picked up a bit, and I could hear the leaves rustling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the person in the trees was watching us, waiting for something. My friend's hand in mine was the only thing that made me feel slightly grounded. We lay there, completely still, barely moving, hoping that whatever it was would just go away. But it didn't. The figure began to move. It circled our tent. Slowly, like it was testing the perimeter, walking around us 3 times. It was methodical, almost like it was trying to figure out how to get closer or whether we were asleep. I could hear its footsteps crunching through the dry leaves and twigs, the sound loud in the otherwise silent night. Every time it passed by, my heart would race faster, and I'd squeeze my friend's hand harder. We didn't dare make a sound. The tension in the air felt like it was suffocating me, but I didn't want to give away that we were awake. I wasn't sure if it was a person who meant us harm, or if they were just wandering, but every instinct in my body screamed at me that something was wrong. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the figure stopped. I heard it moving away from the tent, back down the hill. The footsteps got softer as it disappeared into the trees, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I let out a shaky breath. I wasn't sure if the danger had passed, but I knew we couldn't stay in the tent any longer. We didn't talk. There was no need to. Both of us knew we couldn't stay here alone in the dark anymore. We waited for a while, listening carefully to make sure the figure wasn't circling back. After what felt like an eternity, we finally decided to crawl out of our sleeping bags. We had to be quiet, as if the smallest sound would alert the figure that we were awake. With our hearts still pounding, we slowly unzipped the door to the tent and peeked out. The campsite was eerily silent. There was no sign of anyone or anything near us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. We didn't even dare leave the tent to go to the group leaders, who were still sleeping, because we were terrified that if we did, we'd be vulnerable. We huddled together in the corner of the tent, not sure what to do next, but knowing we couldn't go back to sleep. By morning, the sun started to rise, casting a soft light over the campsite. I didn't feel any safer, but the light at least gave me the courage to venture out. We quietly slipped out of the tent, trying not to wake anyone up. We didn't say a word to the group leaders or any of the other campers. Not because we didn't want to share, but because I didn't even know how to explain what we had seen. We never talked about it in detail to anyone else that day. There was a weird silence between my friend and me, like we both didn't want to acknowledge what had happened. But even after camp ended and we went back to our normal lives, we both brought it up at random times. We'd look at each other, and the memory would come flooding back, like a shadow that refused to leave. It wasn't until much later that we realized how lucky we were. At the time, I couldn't understand why someone would be out there, alone in the dark, just watching kids sleep. As we grew older, we talked about it more, wondering if it had been someone lost or someone with worse intentions. We never knew, and maybe that was the scariest part, the uncertainty of it all. But one thing we knew for sure was that it had been real. And to this day, neither of us has forgotten the way we felt that night, lying there in the dark, holding hands and waiting for something to happen. The memory still lingers, not just of the figure in the trees, but of the fear that wrapped itself around us like a cold, suffocating blanket. We never went back to that campsite, and we never went camping in that area again. And now, whenever we talk about that night, we both agree on one thing. It wasn't the kind of fear you can forget. It sticks with you, always there, a reminder that sometimes the world is scarier than we want to believe.
It was late October, the kind of evening when the air feels crisp, and every rustling leaf seems like a whisper from the past. Halloween was approaching, and the night felt ripe with the energy of a changing season. My friends and I had gathered at my house, taking turns telling ghost stories, trying to outdo one another with the creepiest, most chilling tales. After a while, the mood had shifted. It felt as though the air itself had thickened with anticipation, the old house creaking with the weight of every half-formed ghost story. That's when my friend Rachel spoke up. Her voice had a slight tremor in it, which made me pause. I knew her to be calm, cool, and collected, so hearing her hesitance piqued my curiosity. "I've got a story," she said quietly, almost to herself. "It's true, and it's one I don't tell often. My parents were part of it. You might want to hear it, but it's not like the usual ghost stories we tell around here." Everyone fell silent, and the fire crackled in the corner of the room, casting long shadows. Rachel's parents were always present at our gatherings, often giving advice, making us laugh. I knew this story would be different, but I didn't know how much. The way she looked at us, almost as if she wasn't sure if she wanted to tell it, set the stage. "My mom and dad went on a date once," Rachel started, her voice soft and distant, as if she were drifting back to that time. "It was their first date, actually. They were both into the outdoors, my dad especially. He was always the adventurous type. He took my mom to Provo Canyon that night, near Halloween. They drove up there to go hiking, but what they didn't know, what neither of them could have ever imagined, was that they were walking straight into something sinister." Rachel paused, her eyes flicking toward the window, where the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. "I'm not sure exactly when it happened. All I know is, it started with the weird feeling. The story Rachel told was chilling because of how real it felt. There was no supernatural element, no ghostly encounters. It was all about the feeling that something wasn't right, a gut instinct that we've all experienced but often brush aside when we push forward into the unknown. My dad, well, he was confident. He knew Provo Canyon like the back of his hand. He had climbed those rocks, walked those trails for years. He thought it would be a great place for a first date. Quiet, scenic, and away from the usual noise of town. He told my mom it would be an unforgettable night under the stars. The kind of night you talk about for years. They drove up the canyon, the only sounds coming from the hum of the car engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. It was late, well past midnight, but neither of them thought twice about it. My mom had always been a bit of a night owl. And my dad, well, he'd spent so much time in nature that night's stillness felt familiar, comfortable. They parked the car at the foot of the trail, a small dirt path that led through dense trees. The canyon was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. The stars above were brilliant, but the lack of moonlight made everything else seem unnervingly dark. My dad knew the trail was safe. He'd walked it countless times, but tonight, something about the quiet made him uneasy. That eerie silence, like everything in the woods was holding its breath, was almost too much to ignore. He shook it off, thinking it was just the natural tension of being alone in the wilderness with a girl he was trying to impress. They started walking, their boots crunching softly on the path as they moved deeper into the canyon. The trees towered above them, creating a tunnel of darkness that seemed to close in on them with every step. The air was chilly, the kind of cold that cuts through your clothes and makes you pull your jacket tighter around your shoulders. My dad had that feeling again, the one that gnawed at the back of his mind. He could sense it now, a presence that didn't belong. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the animals. It was something else, something more dangerous. But he kept walking, trying to convince himself that it was just his imagination. He didn't want to look weak in front of my mom, didn't want to admit that he was feeling uneasy. And then it happened. He stepped forward, and his foot collided with something soft in the middle of the path. The sound was wrong, too quiet, like the kind of softness you'd expect from something that didn't belong out here. It wasn't a rock or a branch. No, it was something else. Something that shouldn't have been on that trail. The feeling hit him like a punch to the gut. His heart started racing. He knew they weren't alone. The air around them seemed to pulse with an unnatural tension. My dad couldn't explain it, but every fiber of his being screamed at him to get out of there. He didn't look down at whatever it was his foot had touched. He couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he turned to my mom and saw the same look in her eyes, the same silent acknowledgement that something wasn't right. They didn't say anything to each other. They didn't need to. The silent communication passed between them like an unspoken agreement. They both knew they had to leave. The air felt colder now, even as they turned back toward the trailhead. Every step they took seemed to echo too loudly in the oppressive silence of the woods. The sound of their breathing was almost deafening. They kept looking over their shoulders, certain they were being followed, though they never saw anything. As they walked back down the trail, my dad's mind raced. The unsettling feeling never left him, even as the trees began to thin and the open sky reappeared above them. The hairs on the back of his neck were still standing on end, but he didn't know why. He couldn't explain it. Years passed, and my parents had long forgotten about that night. It was one of those things they never spoke of, just an odd, unsettling memory they brushed aside. It wasn't until much later, when they were watching a news interview with Ted Bundy, that everything clicked into place. The interview was part of a series of tapes released in the 1980s after Bundy's arrest. In it, he talked about the times he had nearly been caught, describing some of the events in vivid detail. My mom and dad were sitting on the couch, watching as Bundy spoke about a time he had been in Provo Canyon. He talked about a girl he had lured into the canyon, how he had done it the way he'd done it so many times before. And then he paused, his voice getting darker as he described the events of that night. "I was in the canyon," Bundy said in the interview, his tone low. "I had just finished what I was doing when I heard someone coming up the trail. A man and a woman. I hid in the trees. They walked right past me, not knowing I was there. And then it happened." Bundy's eyes flicked toward the camera, his smile almost predatory. "A man stepped into the body, just as I had left it. He didn't even look down at it, just turned around and walked away." When my parents heard this, everything fell into place. The feeling they had both experienced that night wasn't just paranoia. They hadn't walked into a place where something was wrong by chance. No, they had walked straight into the aftermath of one of Bundy's crimes. They hadn't known it then. They couldn't have known. But now, looking back, they could see it all, the unexplained feeling in the air, the unshakable unease, and the soft thing my dad had stepped on. Bundy had been watching them, hidden in the trees, observing them as they walked past the body of his victim. And for some reason, Bundy had chosen to remain hidden, to let them walk away. He didn't act. He didn't make a sound. He just watched them, and in his twisted way, he seemed almost amused. They never spoke about it much after that. The revelation had shaken them both, but it was clear now that they had narrowly escaped something much darker than they had ever realized. The memory of that night never fully left them. Even now, when they drive past Provo Canyon, my dad still feels that same unease, that same inexplicable tension. It's strange to think about how close we can come to danger and never realize it. How a split second, a single moment in time, can change everything. For my parents, that night was a close call. They didn't know it then, but now they could never forget. When I was a teenager, there was this small patch of woods not far from where I lived. I'd known about it ever since we moved to the neighborhood, but it wasn't until I was old enough to go off exploring on my own that I really started to appreciate it. It was a wild, unkempt place. The trees were thick, tall, and densely packed together, making it hard to see much past the first few yards in. You'd think it was a forest on some untouched piece of land, but as I found out later, it was far from it. My neighbor Jack and I were always looking for places to hang out, and this forest became our secret retreat. It was our own personal world, where we could build things, break things, and just get away from everything else. The adults never seemed to care much about it, and none of the other kids ever ventured that far into it. It was a place that felt like it belonged to us. Jack and I were the only ones who really used it, unless we brought a few others along. We built dens and forts out there, sometimes by the park near the edge of the woods, sometimes deeper in, when we felt brave enough to go past where we usually stopped. It was strange, though. The further into the woods we went, the older things seemed to get. We'd come across remnants of what looked like old estate grounds. Stone pathways that crumbled underfoot, crumbling old walls half hidden by vines, and most bizarre of all, an old swimming pool. It was strange to see something like that just sitting there, abandoned, with its edges cracked and overrun by weeds. We'd climb down into the pool, pretending it was a secret base or the lair of some villain, depending on what game we were playing that day. But the weirdest part was the way the land seemed to hold on to the past, like it had stories it wanted to tell but couldn't. Jack and I made it a habit to visit the woods every weekend, just to see what new things we could discover. We even found a stash of old magazines one time, tattered, brittle pages, yellowed with age. They were from the 70s, or at least that's what we guessed. It was odd, to say the least, finding something so out of place, but we didn't think much of it. It was just one of those things that made the woods feel like a secret world, full of forgotten things. We would laugh about it, then move on to the next part of the forest. The porn, the dens, the old artifacts, they were all part of the mystery we were unraveling, a world built by other people long gone. After a while, we decided to get serious about building our den. We wanted to make it the best one yet, something no one else could ruin, a fortress hidden deep inside the woods. So one weekend, we grabbed a pair of garden shears and set off to clear a new path through the thicket. We'd been eyeing a part of the woods for a while that had always been blocked off to us. It was surrounded by thick bamboo, the kind that looked like it belonged in a jungle, not a forest in the middle of suburbia. We figured that if we could cut through the bamboo and make a way into this secluded area, we'd have the perfect spot for a den, one that no one would ever find unless we brought them there. It was like carving out a little private kingdom in the heart of the woods. We spent the whole day hacking away at the bamboo with the shears. The thick stalks resisted our efforts, creaking as we bent them to the side or sliced through them. Every time one snapped, it felt like a small victory. By the time we were done, we had made a small archway wide enough to crawl through. We didn't waste any time. Crawling through the gap, we entered into a small clearing. It was quiet in there, strangely so. The trees around us seemed to close in more tightly, the air still and heavy. What really caught our attention, though, was the ground. It was covered entirely in soft, lush clovers, the kind you could sit on all day without getting uncomfortable. There were no tall plants, no ferns or bushes, just a thick carpet of green that spread out in all directions. It felt like a secret garden, hidden away from the world. As we explored further, we noticed something that sent a chill down our spines. Dotted across the clearing were several small statues of fairies. They were carved out of stone, sitting on mushroom-like stools, playing harps or some other instruments. But something was terribly off about them. Every single one had its face smashed off. The stone was cracked, the edges jagged and rough, as if someone had deliberately destroyed them. We kicked one over in a mix of curiosity and defiance, like we were proving something to the forest. But deep down, it felt wrong. In the center of the clearing, we found something even more unsettling. A large stone block, like a rough-hewn coffin, covered with a thick layer of ivy. It looked like it had been there for a very long time, untouched by the rest of the forest. It was weathered, the stone pitted and worn, with a shallow inscription carved into the side that we couldn't make out. The ivy had wrapped itself around it so tightly that it was hard to tell where the plant ended and the stone began. Naturally, our curiosity got the better of us. We both approached it, staring at the stone like it held some great mystery we had to solve. We tried pushing the lid, heaving with all our strength, but it didn't budge. The adrenaline rush was short-lived. The lid felt like it weighed a ton, and even if we'd managed to move it, there was no way we would have been able to lift it off. We took a step back, our breathing a little heavier now. The excitement of discovering something ancient and secret had quickly turned to unease. Still, the clearing was perfect for our den, so we decided to come back the next day with supplies. We planned to bring plywood, some old metal sheeting, and a few other tools we had lying around. The next day was overcast, with dark clouds hanging low in the sky. The wind had picked up, making the trees sway ominously. It wasn't raining yet, but you could feel it in the air, the heaviness, the pressure of an impending storm. We made our way back through the bamboo archway and into the clearing, determined to build the best den we'd ever had. We were just starting to set up when my friend Jack, who had been unpacking the metal sheets, let out a sudden yell. His voice echoed through the trees, sharp and panicked. "Oh, Jesus fucking Christ." I turned confused, only to see him standing frozen next to the stone coffin. The lid was no longer where it had been before. It was pushed aside just slightly, enough that the gap was big enough for a person to crawl through. But there was something about it that froze me in place. The inside was pitch dark, like it led into a tunnel of blackness that went on forever. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think. I just stared into that darkness, my heart hammering in my chest. Without a word, I ran. I don't even remember making the decision. The adrenaline surged through me, and all I could think was that we needed to leave, right now, before whatever had opened that coffin decided to show itself. Jack was right behind me, and we didn't stop running until we were back at the park, panting and gasping for air, the sound of our feet slapping against the wet earth echoing through the trees. We didn't talk much after that. The wind had picked up, and the rain started to pour just as we made it back to the park. The woods, now a maze of shadows, had suddenly become far too large, too dark, and too unpredictable for us. The den we were building was forgotten, the mystery of the coffin unanswered. We never went back. And to this day, I still don't know what was in that coffin. What had moved the lid? What might have been watching us from that darkness? I don't care to know. Some things, once discovered, are better left alone. I've been geocaching in the woods many times before, always looking for new caches tucked away in remote spots. The adventure has always been fun, the thrill of the hunt, the fresh air, the quiet solitude. There's something oddly peaceful about getting lost in the woods and finding these hidden treasures, even if they're just small trinkets. But over time, I began to notice something strange. Sometimes the caches I found felt off. It wasn't just the usual mix of random items left behind by previous cachers. These caches felt like they had a different kind of presence, like they were meant to leave a mark on you in a way you didn't expect. I had found a few odd things here and there. A rusty key with no label, a cracked compass with its needle stuck, a couple of old coins that didn't seem like they belonged in the area. At first, I thought it was just the weirdness that comes with geocaching, but the more I found, the more I started to wonder if there was something darker going on. Then came the ammo box. I had been walking for hours that day, deep in the woods, following the coordinates for a cache that had been logged by a user in the last few days. The trail was remote, isolated, and I hadn't seen anyone else around for hours. That's one of the things I loved about geocaching in these quieter areas. The sense of being completely alone, with only the rustling leaves and the occasional bird call to keep you company. The ammo box was hidden under a pile of moss, so well concealed that I almost missed it. When I pulled it out and opened it, I felt that familiar rush of excitement. Inside were a few trinkets, some torn-up papers, and something I hadn't seen before, broken doll parts. Not just one or two. There were several small pieces of what seemed to be an old porcelain doll. A leg, an arm, a head with a cracked face, its glassy eyes staring up at me. The kind of doll that would have haunted children's nightmares, the kind with that weird, lifeless expression. I didn't know why someone would leave these pieces in the box, but my stomach turned. That wasn't even the worst part. Tucked underneath the doll parts was a handwritten note. The ink was smudged, and the paper was a little crumpled, as if it had been folded and unfolded several times. The note was simple, but it made my heart race. It said in messy handwriting, "Look behind you." I froze. I didn't know what to make of it at first. Maybe it was some sort of joke. The kind of thing that someone left behind just to mess with other cachers? But the more I thought about it, the more the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. No one had been around me for hours, but the note still made my skin crawl. The woods were silent, too silent. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing. Nothing except trees, the long shadows of late afternoon, and the quiet rustle of the wind. I forced myself to laugh it off. It was just a prank, right? The kind of weird stuff people do in the geocaching community to spook others. I had found some strange stuff before. A fake snake in a box once, a plastic rat in another. So maybe this was just another one of those weird stunts. But for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The doll pieces, the note. It wasn't just a prank. It felt deliberate. Someone had left it for me. Someone who knew exactly where I was. I didn't linger any longer. I closed the ammo box, slammed the lid shut, and quickly stashed it back under the moss where I found it. I didn't want to be out there a second longer than I had to. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, to get out of those woods as fast as possible. I started walking back toward the trail, my eyes darting around, constantly scanning my surroundings. It was the middle of the day, but the woods felt different now. The light seemed to be fading faster than it should have, the shadows growing longer with every step. I quickened my pace, my heart thudding in my chest. I wasn't sure what I was afraid of, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I kept telling myself it was all in my head. I was just spooked by the note, by the weirdness of the whole thing. But the further I walked, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I came to a fork in the trail, one path heading toward a clearing and the other winding deeper into the woods. I hesitated for a moment, trying to decide which way to go. I was disoriented. I should have been closer to the car by now, but everything seemed off. The trees were taller here, and the underbrush was thicker, closing in on me. The trail felt less like a path, and more like it was closing up behind me, trapping me. I took the path toward the clearing. As I walked, I heard something that made my heart skip. A branch snapping in the distance. It was the unmistakable sound of someone walking, stepping carefully through the underbrush, trying to be quiet. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Whoever it was, they were getting closer. I looked around frantically. There was no one in sight, but the sound of footsteps was unmistakable. I didn't know if it was another geocacher or someone else entirely, but I couldn't ignore the creeping sensation that they weren't just passing through. They were following me. My mind raced, the fear almost too much to handle. I had always thought geocaching was a fun and harmless hobby, but now, in the middle of these woods, I was starting to feel like I had stumbled into something much darker. I had to keep moving. I wasn't going to wait around to find out who was behind me. I picked up the pace again, walking faster, my footsteps growing louder as I hurried down the trail. The clearing was still some distance ahead, and I knew if I could just make it there, I would have a better chance of seeing who or what was following me. But the footsteps didn't stop. They kept pace with me, always just behind, never too close, but never too far. I could hear them moving in time with my own, just a few steps behind. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. Then, just as I was about to break into the clearing, I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees, partially hidden by the shadows. They were tall, wearing a dark jacket, their face obscured by the darkness of the woods. I couldn't make out any details, but the presence was unmistakable. They were watching me. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran. I didn't stop to look back. I just ran, my legs moving faster than they ever had, pushing through the brush, ignoring the branches that scraped against my skin. I ran as if my life depended on it. I didn't look back until I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking as I unlocked the door and scrambled inside. I slammed the door shut, heart pounding in my chest. I sat there for a long time, staring out at the woods, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The figure in the shadows, the footsteps that had followed me, the note in the ammo box. It all added up to something I couldn't explain. I eventually drove home, but the unease lingered, like a weight pressing down on me. I kept thinking about that figure in the woods, wondering if I had imagined it, or if someone had been out there, waiting for me. I thought about the idea that geocaching, something I had always seen as innocent, could be used as a way to lure someone into the woods, away from help. And I kept thinking about that note. Look behind you. I couldn't stop wondering if it had been a warning that I had narrowly escaped something far worse. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't been alone in the woods, and I wasn't sure I ever would be again. When I was a young boy, I was part of a Boy Scout troop that often went on weekend hiking trips. These trips were mostly a way to get away from the mundane routine of school and home life. I had always enjoyed the idea of hiking, camping, and spending time in the outdoors, but this one trip would stay with me forever for reasons that I could never fully explain. The evening had started like any other. We had been hiking through narrow canyons, winding our way deeper into the woods. The sky was already dark by the time we reached the most remote part of our journey. As we made our way through the canyons, the sky above us seemed to close in, the rocky walls growing higher and higher on both sides, blocking out what little light remained. By then, the only light we had were the flashlights in our hands, cutting narrow beams through the darkness. Our troop leader, Mr. Callahan, had been guiding us carefully, making sure no one strayed off the trail. The air felt thick, and with each step, the only sounds we heard were the crunching of our boots on the gravel path beneath us and the occasional rustle of a distant branch or animal. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, as though the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. We were nearing the campsite, or at least that's what Mr. Callahan had told us, but in the dark, everything looked unfamiliar. The night had swallowed everything whole, and the path ahead was unclear. We turned a bend, the sharp cliff faces on either side narrowing the way even more. That's when we saw him. At first, it didn't make sense. Sitting on a large boulder in the middle of the narrow canyon, there was a man. He didn't look like a hiker or a camper, but he was sitting there, completely still. No flashlight, no camping gear, no backpack, just a man sitting on a boulder in the dark, facing us. My first thought was that maybe he was another hiker who had gotten lost or hurt, but something didn't sit right. The way he was positioned, almost perfectly centered on the boulder, seemed too deliberate. I glanced at my friends. They all saw him, too. We froze in place. A few of us shifted uncomfortably on our feet, unsure of what to do. We were in the middle of nowhere, and our campsite was still far off. It didn't make sense for anyone to be out here in the dark without any gear. The moment stretched on, but the man didn't move, just sat there, like he was waiting for something. The beam from my flashlight flickered slightly as I aimed it toward his face. That's when he spoke. "It's rude to shine light on people's faces," he said, his voice cutting through the stillness of the canyon. It wasn't a shout or even a loud statement. It was disturbingly calm and quiet, like he was talking to us from a place that wasn't quite in the same reality. The words sent a chill down my spine. My heart raced, and I immediately lowered my flashlight. The others did the same. We had all been taught to respect the people we met on the trail, but this felt different. This felt wrong. I could feel the tension thick in the air. For a moment, none of us moved. We just stood there, staring at the man. The canyon felt even darker now, and the shadows seemed to press in closer. I could barely make out the features of the man's face in the dim light, but there was something unsettling about the way he looked at us. His eyes were wide, too wide, and there was something unblinking about his gaze, like he hadn't blinked in a long time. His skin looked pale, and his clothes were dark, too dark for someone out hiking at night. Finally, Mr. Callahan broke the silence. He cleared his throat and took a step back. "Sorry, sir," he said in a voice that was almost apologetic, though I could hear the unease in his tone. "We'll just be on our way." We all shuffled backward, but the man didn't move. He just sat there, watching us as we slowly backed away. His stare seemed to follow us as we turned and continued down the path, making sure not to shine our flashlights in his direction. The air around us felt colder, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. It was as if the encounter had disrupted the very air in the canyon. Once we had rounded a corner and were out of sight, we stopped. We didn't speak at first. We didn't need to. The encounter had rattled us all in different ways, and no one wanted to break the silence. A few of the boys muttered to each other, but it wasn't much more than nervous chatter. We were all thinking the same thing, though. There was something about that man that didn't make sense. Why was he out here in the middle of nowhere, sitting alone on a rock in the dark? "Did you see his eyes?" one of the boys finally asked. "Yeah," I replied. "Too wide. Like he didn't blink at all." "I don't like it," another one of my friends, Jake, said. "What if he's just, I don't know, lost or crazy?" "Just keep moving," Mr. Callahan said sharply, his voice low but firm. "We're almost at the campsite. Don't think about it." but the encounter lingered in the back of my mind. I kept imagining the way he had looked at us, the way his voice had sent chills down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong about the whole situation. When we finally reached the campsite, we tried to put it out of our minds. The fire was built quickly, and we all sat around it, talking in hushed tones. No one mentioned the man again, but I could tell everyone was thinking about him. We went through the usual routines of camping, setting up tents, gathering firewood, and roasting marshmallows, but there was an underlying unease. The woods felt quieter than usual, like even the forest was holding its breath. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I kept thinking about the man, about his eyes, about the way he had just sat there, waiting for us. I heard every little noise outside the tent, every snap of a twig, every rustling leaf. The dark woods seemed to press in on me, and I couldn't escape the feeling that something, or someone, was out there watching. By morning, we had all agreed on one thing. Psycho Craig, as we had dubbed him, had left a lasting impression on all of us. None of us wanted to talk about it too much, but we all knew we'd seen something strange. Mr. Callahan made sure we packed up early, and we were out of the canyon before the sun was fully up. When we returned home, I tried to tell my parents about the strange encounter, but the words never seemed to come out right. It didn't sound like a normal story, not one that would make sense to anyone who hadn't been there. I could see the way their eyes glazed over as I talked about the man in the canyon, and I realized something important. No one would ever really understand what we saw that night. Over the years, I've thought back on that night many times, wondering who that man was and why he was sitting alone in the dark. Some part of me still wonders if we were lucky to have gotten out of there without any further encounters, or if we were just too naive to realize that something far worse was watching us from the shadows. The truth is, I'll never know what happened that night, and part of me doesn't want to know. But I can tell you this, when I think back on it, I don't feel scared anymore. I just feel grateful. Grateful that we were able to walk away. Grateful that we made it to camp safely. And grateful that Psycho Craig never followed us home. But the woods, they never quite feel the same after that. I'm a ranger at Yellowstone, stationed in the heart of the park, where the air is thick with the scent of pine and wild earth, and the wilderness stretches endlessly, untouched by the hands of civilization. The job is a dream for someone who loves nature, but it's not without its darker moments, moments that are easy to dismiss if you're not paying attention. I've been working in the park for a while now, and I've seen my fair share of strange things, but nothing quite like what I saw a couple of weeks ago in the Lamar Valley. It started as any other day. The sun was just rising, casting the valley in a soft golden light. I had been tasked with a routine patrol, nothing out of the ordinary. The Lamar Valley is a beautiful place, one of the most serene spots in the park. It's wide open, with rolling grasslands dotted with bison, pronghorns, and elk. A perfect place for wildlife watching, and for me, a place I felt a sense of peace. But that day, as I walked down the trail, the peace was shattered. I was about 11 miles from the nearest road, further still from the park boundary. It was early enough that no other rangers would be anywhere near me, and the quiet was suffocating. I could hear nothing but the occasional rustle of the grass in the breeze and the distant calls of birds. But as I rounded a bend in the trail, I froze. There, right in the middle of the trail, was a deer head. I don't mean a deer carcass, or even a part of a carcass. This was a head, severed cleanly at the neck. No blood, no sign of a struggle, no raggedness around the edges where it had been cut off. Just a perfect, smooth cut, like someone had taken a knife to it. The head was laying in the middle of the path, staring up at the sky with wide, glassy eyes. The tongue was still in the mouth, and the eyes were intact. No sign of decay or vultures pecking at it. It was like something out of a nightmare, except I was awake, and I was standing right there, staring at it. I've seen wolf kills. I've seen bear kills. I even used to track cougars in South Dakota, studying their predation patterns after they made a kill. But this wasn't like anything I had ever seen. Wolves, when they kill, they tear into the flesh. Bears do the same. Even cougars, with their stealthy attacks, don't leave the carcass perfectly intact. But this deer head, there wasn't even a trace of blood. It was as if it had been placed there, carefully and deliberately. I knelt down, not wanting to touch it but feeling compelled to examine it. The grass around it was undisturbed, not a single footprint or sign of movement. And the air, usually thick with the earthy scent of nature, felt still, unnaturally still. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched, like there's something just out of sight waiting. I glanced around, but the valley was wide open. There were no trees nearby that could provide cover. The hills in the distance were empty, save for the occasional bison grazing lazily on the hillside. Even the ravens, who usually circle overhead at the first sign of carrion, were nowhere to be seen. It didn't make sense. The deer head just sat there untouched. No sign of any predator having been through recently. No scat, no tracks, no scent in the air that would suggest a recent kill or attack. It was like the head had materialized out of thin air. The absence of the rest of the body made it even stranger. In the wild, when something dies, it's usually scavenged pretty quickly. But this head, it was untouched. As if whatever had done this wasn't interested in eating it. I took a step back, my mind racing. Who would do something like this? And why leave it in the middle of the trail? It didn't make sense. The trail was used by other park visitors, so I was careful not to leave the head where it was. I had no idea what could have happened, but I knew I couldn't just leave it out there. I took a few steps back, pulled my phone from my pack, and snapped a few pictures, hoping to gather evidence. Then I decided to carry it back to the ranger station, or at least get it off the trail. As I turned to leave, I heard something. A soft sound, barely audible over the wind. A rustling in the grass, coming from behind me. I froze, heart pounding. I turned around slowly, but there was nothing there. Just the tall grass swaying gently in the breeze. I thought I had imagined it, but the feeling didn't go away. It was the kind of feeling you get when you know you're not alone, but when you look around, you see nothing. I hurried back to the trailhead, not daring to look over my shoulder again. The whole way back, I felt like I was being watched. My senses were heightened, and every snap of a twig or gust of wind sent me into a state of hyper-awareness. But nothing followed me. I made it back to my truck and headed straight for the station. Once I was safely back, I couldn't shake the image of that severed deer head from my mind. I showed the photos to a few other rangers, but none of them had ever seen anything like it either. We all agreed that it wasn't the work of any animal we knew of. The pattern was too clean, too deliberate, and the lack of scavenger activity, ravens, coyotes, even bears, was unsettling. I spent the next few days thinking about it. I combed through my notes, trying to find some explanation, but everything pointed back to the same question. Why? Why leave it there? Why cut it so perfectly? And why was it untouched? I went back to the Lamar Valley a few days later, hoping to find something, anything, that would explain what had happened. I retraced my steps, walking along the trail where I had found the head. But there was nothing. The grass was still, the valley just as peaceful as before. No new evidence, no signs of anything out of the ordinary. But as I walked further down the trail, something caught my eye. It was faint, almost imperceptible. A dark stain on the ground, just off the path. I knelt down, carefully inspecting it. It wasn't blood, but it was something else. Something dark and oily, like tar or resin. I touched it carefully with my glove, and it had an odd, almost metallic smell to it. It didn't make sense. I stood up and surveyed the area. Nothing else. Just the rolling hills, the bison grazing in the distance, and the quiet of the valley. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, hidden just beyond the edge of the grass. Watching. Waiting. I left the Lamar Valley that day with more questions than answers. The deer head had been an anomaly, something that didn't fit with anything I knew about the park. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there was something bigger at play here. Something I didn't understand. I've been back a few times since, but I haven't found anything else. The park remains the same, vast, beautiful, and wild. But every time I walk those trails, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. And every time I pass through that stretch of the Lamar Valley, I wonder if I'll find another deer head, or worse, something else entirely. What happened in the valley that day, I may never fully understand. But one thing's for sure. There's something out there in the wilderness of Yellowstone, something that doesn't play by the rules of nature. Something that's been hiding, just out of sight, for longer than any of us can imagine. Every summer, for as long as I can remember, my family would pack up our old camping gear and head out to our property in Utah. It wasn't much, just a patch of land deep in the woods, surrounded by dense trees and a silent stillness that felt like it existed outside of time. We'd set up our tents in the meadow and spend the next few days pretending that the rest of the world didn't exist. The property was isolated, cut off from any real civilization, and that was the way we liked it. Most of the time, it was peaceful. In fact, for years, the only real excitement came from the occasional sighting of wildlife. A deer here, a rabbit there. But the most memorable animal we ever saw was a chipmunk, a particularly fat one. It was more of a running joke in our family, how we would spot that little rodent waddling around, nibbling at crumbs. We laughed about it every summer. But it wasn't until that morning, one morning that would haunt me, that I realized how wrong we were to take the woods so lightly. It was still early when I woke up. The sky had barely begun to lighten, the air cool with the promise of a new day. The rest of the family was still asleep in their tents, but my dad, as always, was already up. He had a habit of getting up before dawn, sitting outside with his coffee, just staring into the trees, the way some people would meditate. He never said much during those moments. It was as if he was trying to connect with something deeper out there, in the quiet, dark woods. I was groggy, still half dreaming, when I heard the first noise, a ruckus coming from the tree line. It was distant at first, muffled, like the rustling of something moving through the thick underbrush. But it grew louder, a series of snaps and crunches, the sound of heavy steps moving fast. I was still in my sleeping bag, barely able to lift my head, when I heard my dad's voice, low and calm, but with an edge to it, like he'd already sensed something. "Don't get up," he muttered to no one in particular. I could tell he wasn't talking to us. He was talking to himself, trying to calm his nerves. I was already getting to my feet when I heard it. The deer. It came out of the trees like it had been kicked out, its legs flailing beneath it as it sprinted across the meadow. Its white tail was a flash of brightness against the darker green of the grass, and I could see its muscles working beneath the soft fur as it ran for its life. My dad didn't move. His eyes were locked onto the deer, and I could see the realization cross his face. He knew something was chasing it. I didn't know what was going on until I heard the sound of claws digging into the earth, a terrible, heavy sound. Something fast was closing in, then a blur of motion. A mountain lion. The predator came out of the woods at breakneck speed, its yellow eyes focused on the deer. The moment it crossed into the open, it pounced. The deer didn't stand a chance. The lion's powerful jaws closed around its throat in a flash, and the two of them disappeared into the trees, the animal's last desperate cry ringing through the air. My dad's coffee cup slipped from his hand and hit the ground with a soft thud. His eyes were wide, but he didn't move. I could hear the echo of his breath in the still morning air, but he didn't say a word. He didn't need to. I watched as the lion dragged the deer into the woods, the blood already starting to stain the grass. My dad didn't look away, but I could see his hands shaking, his knuckles white as they gripped the armrests of the chair. That wasn't just a predator in the woods. That was something dangerous, something far beyond what we had ever encountered before. When we all finally woke up, it wasn't the usual slow-moving, quiet morning of our family camping trips. There was an energy in the air that wasn't there before. We were all drawn to the meadow, where the deer had been. The grass was still trampled in the spot where the lion had struck, but there was something else now, something darker. Fresh tracks. Massive, heavy prints that were too deep to be from anything small. They were unmistakably from a large predator, a cat. There was no mistaking the shape of the paws, the claws that had left their mark. And there was blood. A trail of it, leading from the meadow into the woods, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. For the first time in years, I felt the air around us grow thick. The woods, which had always felt like an old friend, suddenly felt like something else. Something unknown. Dad didn't say much that morning. His eyes were hard, focused on the bloodstained trail, and we could all tell he was thinking about something. There was no more coffee in his hands. Only a beer, cracked open early, that can cool in his fingers. I never asked why. I didn't need to. The rest of us followed the trail for a while, but none of us were comfortable. It didn't take long before we turned back, uneasy, our footsteps too loud in the silence of the trees. There was a weight to the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. We had always been alone out here, but now we weren't. And I don't know when it happened, but at that moment, we knew the woods had changed. Later that day, when we all gathered around the fire, the conversation turned to the lion. Dad didn't speak much about it. He never did. But I caught the look in his eyes, the fear. Not just for what we had seen, but for what we hadn't. It was no longer just the fat chipmunk in the meadow. It was the mountain lion, stalking the edges of the trees, lurking in the shadows. The woods, the place we had always thought of as home, had changed. And now, with every crack of a branch, every snap of a twig, we knew that something else was out there. Something we weren't ready for. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things in the dark, small sounds, the skittering of animals I couldn't see, the wind whispering through the trees. And then, just before dawn, I heard something else. A scream. I don't know what it was. It didn't sound like an animal. It didn't sound like a person either. It was a raw, guttural cry that seemed to come from deep in the woods. It was loud, and it was terrifying. I lay still, frozen, trying to figure out if it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. But it was real. It was something that sent chills crawling up my spine, something that made the air in the tent feel colder, heavier. When I finally managed to get out of bed, I found my dad sitting outside, staring at the trees again. The first light of morning was creeping over the horizon, and I could see that he hadn't slept at all. He looked at me, then back to the woods. "There's something out there," he said quietly, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Something we haven't seen before." And for the first time in my life, I realized how true that was. It wasn't just the lion. There was something more, something bigger. And it was out there, watching us, waiting. We packed up early that day and left the property without much discussion. My dad didn't say much on the drive back, and neither did anyone else. But when I looked over at him, his grip tight on the wheel, his eyes scanning the road ahead, I knew. He hadn't been afraid of the mountain lion. Not really. It was the woods themselves that scared him. We never went back to that property. Not after that summer. Maybe it was just the way things were, something that had shifted in the land. Or maybe it was the way we had changed. But the forest never felt the same again. And every time I close my eyes at night, I hear that scream. It was late, the kind of late when the world goes still, and the only thing keeping you company is the sound of the fire crackling, the rustling of leaves in the wind, and the occasional bark of my dog. The air had a bite to it that night, the kind of chill that sank into your bones, even through the thickest layers of clothing. We were 2 hours from the nearest town, in the middle of nowhere, camping out in the vast Wyoming wilderness. The kind of wilderness you'd only find if you were looking for it, far from the beaten path. It felt like being on the edge of the world, where the only things that could find you were the stars above and the shadows in the distance. It was me, my dad, my friend Mark, and our dog, Rosie. Rosie was the calmest dog I'd ever had, and that's saying something because I'd had plenty of dogs in my life. She was a mutt, but she was a good one, always friendly, always loyal, and always quiet. I'd never heard her growl or bark at anything. She didn't care if a bear wandered through our campsite or if another dog came too close. She just assumed everything was either a friend or something she could eat. No fear. Just blissful, oblivious acceptance. That night, my dad was already asleep. He was the kind of guy who could fall asleep anywhere, no matter how uncomfortable or out of place. He had a chair near the fire, a blanket wrapped around him, and he was out cold. Mark and I were still wide awake, though. We were sitting on the ground, the warmth of the campfire between us, enjoying the silence and the cold night air. The fire crackled, sending sparks up into the sky, and we talked about everything and nothing. Mostly, we were just soaking in the experience, the deep wilderness of Wyoming surrounding us on all sides. The only sounds we heard were our voices and the occasional rustling of the trees. We'd been on this trip for a few days, and everything had been perfect so far. No problems, no issues. Just a few friends and a dog getting away from it all. Then, out of nowhere, everything changed. It happened so suddenly that it took me a second to process. Rosie, who had been lying beside the fire like she always did, suddenly jumped up with a single sharp bark. It was the first time I'd ever heard her bark like that, loud, aggressive, and unmistakably full of warning. She froze in place, her head locked in the direction of a field next to our campsite. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The atmosphere shifted. It felt like something was off. Something was wrong. Mark and I exchanged a glance, both of us instantly on edge. Neither of us spoke for a moment. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, faster now. Rosie was still growling, her low, rumbling growl vibrating through the night air, the kind of sound you'd expect from a dog protecting its territory. But Rosie didn't protect anything. She was too trusting for that. The fact that she was acting this way was enough to make my blood run cold. "What is it, girl?" I whispered, my voice barely above a murmur, as if speaking too loudly might disturb whatever was out there. Rosie's eyes were locked onto the dark field beyond the firelight. It was impossible to see much beyond the edge of the campsite, where the shadows of the trees and the tall grass blended together. I tried to peer into the darkness, but all I could make out was a vague shape moving in the distance. My eyes were straining, and I wasn't sure if I was seeing things. Then Mark whispered, "Do you see that?" I nodded, though I still wasn't sure what I was looking at. There were figures, shadows, moving in the field beyond the trees. It was difficult to make sense of them, the darkness playing tricks on my mind, but there was something undeniably off about the way they moved. They weren't walking in any normal way. They weren't human. I couldn't say why, but the movement didn't match the natural rhythm of anything I'd seen before. "Who's out there?" I called out, my voice trembling. It was a stupid question, I knew. There was no one out there. We were in the middle of nowhere. No one was supposed to be out here. Mark didn't say anything. He just stared, wide-eyed, at the shadows. Rosie continued to growl, her eyes locked on the field, her body tense. And then I heard it, the sound that made my stomach turn. It wasn't the sound of footsteps. It wasn't the sound of someone talking in English, or any language I recognized. It was low and murmuring, a conversation, but the words weren't words I could understand. It sounded like a language, but it wasn't. It felt wrong, like the voices were coming from everywhere at once, as if the very air around us had come alive with noise. I felt an unnatural chill crawl up my spine. "What the hell is that?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. It was like he couldn't tear his eyes away from the shadows. Neither could I. We were frozen. Neither of us moved, unsure of what to do, unsure if we should be making noise, running, or just waiting. But we didn't wake my dad. I don't know why. Maybe because part of me didn't want to believe what was happening. Maybe I didn't want to see him wake up, half asleep, and brush it off like it was nothing. Maybe I didn't want to feel foolish for being scared of something I couldn't explain. So we sat there in the dark, listening to the sounds in the field, watching the shadows as they moved. The conversation continued for what felt like an eternity, though I'm sure it was only a few minutes. I could hear my own breathing now, shallow and quick, as I tried to make sense of the situation. Was it animals? Could it be other campers? But no, it didn't feel like that. Nothing about this felt normal. Eventually, after what seemed like the longest 10 minutes of my life, the shadows in the field began to retreat. They didn't walk away, they just faded, like they weren't ever there to begin with, and then suddenly they were gone. The sounds of the murmured conversation ceased, and the air felt heavy, still, like nothing had ever happened. Rosie stopped growling. Her body relaxed. She turned around, lay back down, and closed her eyes, as if nothing had happened at all. Mark and I sat there in stunned silence. My heart was still pounding, but the feeling of danger, of something being wrong, lingered in the air like a thick fog. It wasn't a feeling I could shake off, even as the minutes stretched on. We didn't speak. We just stared into the darkness where the figures had been, trying to process what had just happened. It wasn't until my dad stirred, groaning as he woke up, that I snapped out of it. He yawned and rubbed his eyes, completely unaware of the terror we'd just experienced. I didn't even know what to say to him. How could I explain it? How could I say, "Hey, Dad, we were just sitting here, and we saw some shadows and heard some people talking in a language we don't understand, but don't worry, it's fine"? So we didn't tell him. Mark and I just went back to sitting in silence, staring into the fire, our minds racing with what we'd just witnessed. Rosie, the calmest, most oblivious dog I'd ever known, never reacted to anything like that again in the entire decade we had her. It was the one and only time she'd ever acted that way, and even though time has passed, the memory of that night still haunts me. I still don't know what we saw that night, or who, or what those shadows were. And I'll never forget the sound of their voices, drifting through the air like an eerie whisper, always just out of reach. We left Wyoming a few days later, never speaking about it again. But I still wonder what it was. I still get a cold feeling when I think about it, the same feeling I had when the shadows disappeared, and the night fell silent once more. I'll never know what we saw that night, and I'll never stop thinking about it. We had been camping on that piece of land for years. It was an old rancher's place, the kind of place that seemed to be stuck in the past. There were stories that it had been abandoned for decades, but still, the land held something, a sense of emptiness. I didn't think much of it at the time. My Boy Scout troop camped there often enough, training for the jamboree, learning the basics of survival, and working on merit badges. It was the perfect spot, far enough from town that we felt isolated, but not so far we couldn't get help if something went wrong. That particular weekend, we had set up camp near the remains of an old barn. The structure had long collapsed, its timbers rotted and splintered, but there were still a few posts standing, remnants of what once had been a building. We had always used this part of the land for our fire pit, and the grass was tall around it, adding a sense of quiet to the air. But for some reason, this time felt different. Maybe it was because we were all growing older, or maybe it was the way the wind seemed to whip through the trees at odd angles, the branches creaking and groaning like the land was alive. At the time, I dismissed it. We were Boy Scouts, tough, prepared, used to the woods. We had been given an assignment, build a structure, anything, that we could use in camp. It could be a shelter, a tool, whatever we could imagine, as long as we could justify it in the context of survival. One of the kids, Eric, I think, decided he wanted to build a tripod, something simple yet functional. He said it would be a great way to hang a pot over the fire for cooking. And of course, the rest of us just followed along, like we always did. We had no idea how much that tripod would come to mean. The tripod itself was simple, just 3 long poles lashed together at the top. It wasn't much more than a framework for holding a pot over the fire, but it felt significant in the moment. We all helped Eric build it, tying the knots tight, making sure the structure would hold. We were proud of it. It felt like a real accomplishment. As the day went on, we found other ways to fill the time, setting up tents, gathering firewood, and doing our usual scout duties. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then, as the sun started to set, something odd happened. A kid named Sam wandered off near the edge of the camp, where the land dropped off toward an old stone wall. He came back with something in his hands, his face pale as a ghost. "A cow's skull," he said, almost whispering it. We all gathered around, taking a look. It was weathered, covered in dirt, the bones cracked and jagged. At first, we weren't sure what to make of it. A cow's skull? Out here in the middle of nowhere. It seemed strange, but there was nothing truly horrifying about it. Just a relic of the land, an old piece of the past. I wasn't the only one who thought it was strange. Everyone seemed unsettled by it, but we shrugged it off. One of the older scouts, Peter, made a joke about it, saying it was probably just a farm relic left behind when the rancher moved on. So we left it at that. But when we were packing up to leave the next morning, we found the skull sitting on top of the tripod. I don't know who did it, but there it was. The skull had been placed carefully on the frame of the tripod, the empty eye sockets staring out into the wilderness, as though it had always been meant to be there. We all stood there for a few moments, unsure of what to do. Finally, someone, I think it was Tim, said something about how cool it looked, and in our usual way, we didn't think much more of it. We left without a second thought, the skull still perched on the tripod like a strange monument. It wasn't until later that we realized how unsettling it really was. A month passed. Nothing more was said about it. We went on with our lives. The jamboree came and went, and we all moved on, still kids, still thinking the world was small. But then something happened that none of us could ignore. It was a Thursday when I first saw the story. I had been walking home from school, and as I passed by the local convenience store, I saw a newspaper on the rack outside. The headline caught my eye: "Devil Worshippers Found on Komarek's Property." My heart stopped for a moment, and I remember the chill running down my spine as I grabbed the paper and flipped it open. There, on the front page, was a photo of the tripod. It was unmistakable. The tripod was standing in the same spot where we had left it, only now, there was the cow's skull sitting at the top. But it wasn't just the tripod that caught my attention. The story beneath it sent a shiver through my body. According to the article, the old man Komarek's land had been found with signs of a ritualistic ceremony. The authorities had found a series of strange symbols drawn on the ground, as well as a fire pit that seemed to have been used recently. And in the center of it all was the tripod with the cow skull. The paper didn't outright say it was devil worshippers, but they didn't have to. The insinuation was clear enough. I don't remember much of the rest of the article. My mind was racing. The piece of land we had camped on, the place where we had built that stupid tripod, had become the site of a rumored ritual. People were talking about it. It was no longer just some forgotten stretch of land. It had become infamous. I spent the next few days in a daze, replaying everything in my head. The skull, the tripod, the fire pit. Did we unknowingly contribute to something that looked like a ritual? Were we just clueless kids messing around? Or was there something more to it than we had realized? I didn't know, but the thought haunted me. As the weeks went by, the story began to grow. People in school talked about it, the creepy place to take a date or to avoid altogether. Some kids even claimed they'd been out there and seen things, heard strange sounds, and felt the air grow cold. They weren't sure what they were describing, but it didn't matter. The legend of that place had taken on a life of its own. It was then that I realized the truth. No one had ever come forward and admitted to what had happened. No one from our troupe ever said anything about the skull or the tripod. We all went about our lives as if it had never happened. No one owned up to it. Maybe we were all scared of what it had become. Maybe we just didn't want to be associated with it. Either way, the truth never came out. The story in the paper faded, but the legend of the place grew stronger. People still talk about it today. A creepy spot out in the woods, haunted by something we'll never fully understand. I don't go there anymore. I can't. There's something about that place that's wrong, something we couldn't see when we were kids. Maybe it was just the land itself, or maybe it was something we unwittingly started. But whatever it was, it never truly let go. As for the cow's skull, it disappeared not long after the story broke. No one knows who took it or what happened to it, but the tripod remains a part of the legend. And even now, I can't shake the feeling that we were all just pieces in a bigger puzzle, one that no one will ever truly understand. The truth, as they say, is never as simple as we'd like to think. And sometimes, the scariest thing about something is how easily it can slip into legend. I had just arrived in a tiny, forgotten town deep in South America, a place so remote that even the locals spoke with a slow drawl, as if time itself had forgotten to rush through the village. My travel companions, a group of backpackers from all over the world, had decided to rest for the night at a small, rustic guest house run by a family. The wooden structure was aging, with moss growing in patches on the sloped roof, and it gave off the unmistakable scent of damp earth and old wood. The air was heavy, thick with the aroma of the surrounding jungle, and the constant buzz of insects in the distance added to the eerie stillness that enveloped the place. The town was little more than a collection of homes along a dirt road that seemed to disappear into the thick jungle. I had been feeling antsy, tired of the crowded conversations and the constant movement of my companions. I wanted solitude, a break from the noise. So, I decided to take a walk, hoping the quiet of the wilderness would clear my mind. I hadn't made it more than a few hundred yards from the guest house when the town faded behind me, swallowed by the vast stretch of trees and thick underbrush. The sound of the river, a deep, constant gurgle, reached my ears. The path I was on led toward it, twisting between trees and over tangled roots. There was something calming about the sight of the river cutting through the forest, its water dark but clear. The trees on the opposite bank stood tall, their branches reaching out like long, skeletal fingers toward the sky. I walked along the edge of the river, my boots sinking into the soft, damp ground. My thoughts drifted to nothing in particular as I moved forward, enjoying the stillness and the coolness of the shade. The air smelled fresh here, not like the stagnant, dusty air of the village. It smelled of water, of damp earth, of something wild. My senses felt sharper in this space, attuned to the sounds of the forest around me. The rustle of leaves, the distant calls of birds, and the steady flow of the river. But then something caught my eye. Ahead of me, a large rock jutted out from the ground, a jagged mass that rose from the earth almost like an ancient monument. It was out of place among the softer, rounder shapes of the surrounding rocks. As I got closer, I noticed that the rock had a small overhang that formed a kind of cave, a shadowy recess that seemed to promise cool shelter from the heat of the day. I felt a strange pull toward it, a curiosity that urged me to investigate. I stepped closer to the cave, the air around it cool and damp, a stark contrast to the warmth of the sun filtering through the trees. As I looked inside, something caught my eye, something white, almost glowing against the dark earth. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what it was, a human skull. It lay in the dirt, half covered by leaves and moss, its hollow eye sockets staring up at me. It was weathered, old, its bones yellowed with time, but there was no mistaking what it was. A chill ran down my spine, and I froze, staring at it. My first instinct was to look around, but the jungle was quiet, too quiet. No one was nearby, no sound of footsteps or voices to explain the skull's presence. I stepped back slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what to make of it. It was the kind of thing you see in movies, not something you come across on a random walk. But the strangest part was that it didn't seem to belong to any grave or burial site. The skull was just lying there, alone, abandoned, as if someone had carelessly discarded it. Before I could process what I was seeing, a shout broke the silence. It was a voice, harsh and distant, but clear enough to understand. "Vasa morir," the voice yelled. It was angry, filled with warning and hostility. I jerked my head up, my eyes scanning the other side of the river. There, standing on the opposite bank, was a man. He was dressed in simple, worn clothes, a farmer, perhaps, and he was waving a long hoe above his head. His face was twisted in anger, and his eyes locked on me, full of something that felt too intense for this remote, quiet place. I didn't know what he was shouting. Maybe it was the language barrier or the fear that had set in, but whatever he was saying felt threatening. My heart pounded in my chest as I quickly turned and began to run, my footsteps clumsy as I scrambled away from the skull and the strange man. I wasn't sure why, but every part of me screamed to leave, to get as far away from that place as possible. The path back seemed longer now, the river rushing beside me as I moved away from the cave. The sounds of the jungle, which had once felt soothing, now seemed louder, more oppressive, as if the trees themselves were closing in on me. My breath came in short, quick bursts, my chest tightening with each step. I didn't look back. I couldn't. When I finally made it back to the guest house, my legs trembling with exhaustion, I barely noticed the worried looks from my travel companions as I stumbled through the door. I was shaken, my mind still reeling from what I had seen. The skull, the man on the opposite bank. Everything about it felt wrong, like I had unknowingly crossed some unseen boundary. I didn't tell them right away what had happened. I didn't know how to explain it. How could I? I was still trying to process it myself. But as I sat down, trying to catch my breath, I blurted it out without thinking. "I saw heads. Heads," I said, my voice shaking. The looks on their faces were confused, even a little amused. I hadn't realized what I had said until after the words left my mouth. Heads. What did that even mean? I felt embarrassed. One of my companions, a woman who spoke some Spanish, asked me what I meant. "¿Qué quieres decir con cabezas, stiasquid?" I tried to explain, but all I could think of were the skulls, the white, hollow eye sockets staring up at me from the ground. It was only later, after some awkward attempts at explaining, that I realized my mistake. I hadn't meant heads, in the way it was commonly understood in Spanish. I meant skulls, but in my panic and confusion, I had mixed up the words. The locals, still puzzled by my strange outburst, eventually figured it out. They looked at each other and laughed nervously, as if the whole situation were just a misunderstanding, a miscommunication between the foreign traveler and the village. But even then, I wasn't sure if I felt better. I kept thinking about the skull in that small cave, about the man on the other side of the river. What had he been trying to tell me? Was it a warning? And if so, what was I being warned about? It didn't take long for the tension to slip away, replaced by the slow, aching realization that something had been wrong there. Something had been waiting, and I had stumbled into it. The unease lingered in the back of my mind for the rest of the trip, an unsettling feeling that never quite went away. And when I left the town days later, I found myself looking over my shoulder more often than I would have liked, wondering if the man with the hoe had been just trying to protect me, or if I had been lucky to get away when I did. When I was a kid, I often heard my dad tell stories from his days as a tour guide in Namibia, particularly about his time in the Etosha Pan. Those were stories of vast, empty landscapes, wildlife, and the raw, unforgiving power of nature. It wasn't until much later that I truly understood the weight of some of those stories, the ones that never got told in full. One in particular always stuck with me. It wasn't dramatic in the way most adventure tales are. There was no sudden attack, no life or death struggle. It was one of those quiet moments in the wild, where the danger doesn't announce itself with a roar or a sudden movement. It's the kind of thing that stays with you, quietly gnawing at your mind, making you second-guess everything you thought you knew. My dad had been a tour guide for several years, and he'd taken hundreds of people on expeditions across the Etosha Pan. If you don't know, the Etosha Pan is a massive, dry lakebed in Namibia, surrounded by salt pans and waterholes. It's both beautiful and desolate. Beautiful because of its vast, open landscapes, and desolate because it feels like the kind of place where life can't really survive. But life does exist there, just in ways you can't always see, and in places where you least expect it. One of the perks of the job was that my dad got to explore the wilderness up close, staying with guests for extended periods of time, guiding them through the natural world. A lot of the tours involved sleeping out in the open, beneath the stars, in nothing but sleeping bags and the thin veil of a tent. The guests would fall asleep listening to the sounds of the bush, and my dad would watch over them, making sure nothing too dangerous wandered too close to the camp. There was one tour that stood out. A couple had hired my dad to guide them through a week-long adventure in the pan. From what my dad told me, they were well-prepared and enthusiastic. They'd wanted the full experience, the isolation, the sounds, the animals. So, my dad led them into the heart of Etosha, away from the usual tourist routes, to a place that not many people dared venture into. It wasn't until they were about 3 days into their trip that things began to get strange. That night, as the wind howled across the salt pans and the sky stretched dark and endless above them, my dad woke up to a sound that made him freeze. At first, he thought it was the couple, maybe one of them snoring too loudly. The sound was constant and thick, vibrating through the stillness of the night. But there was something off about it, something deeper. It wasn't just the sound of someone snoring. It was almost like a growl, punctuated with short, rhythmic bursts that felt more animal than human. My dad lay there in the dark for a moment, trying to make sense of the noise. It was so loud and steady, like it was right next to him. The air around him seemed to thrum with the vibrations, but he couldn't see anything in the darkness. He looked over at the couple. Both of them were fast asleep, lying next to each other in their sleeping bags. The woman was facing away from him, but the man, he was facing toward my dad. And yet, the snoring came from somewhere else. It was coming from somewhere just beyond the campfire's dying embers, from the shadows that stretched across the ground. It took a few moments for my dad to fully wake up. Then something clicked. That wasn't snoring. The sound was too deep, too consistent. It wasn't human at all. It was too raw, like the growl of an animal with a lot of power, a creature that could hunt under the cover of darkness. He froze. His mind raced. Could it be a lion? No, lions don't usually move this close to humans in the dead of night unless they feel cornered or threatened. Was it a hyena? They have that strange, laughter-like sound, but this was different. It was far too low and deep. It felt more like something big, something dangerous. He lay there, unmoving, listening. The sound continued, like a dull roar that reverberated in his chest. Then it stopped abruptly. Everything fell silent. The kind of silence that fills your ears with the ringing of your heartbeat. My dad didn't sleep the rest of the night. He kept his eyes on the shadows around them, knowing that something was out there, watching. His mind kept returning to the sound, to the feeling that he wasn't alone. It wasn't like any animal he'd ever encountered in his years of guiding. The next morning, the silence of the night hung over everything, making the world seem unreal. He got up, trying not to disturb the couple as they packed up, but his mind kept racing. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Something had been out there, and it wasn't the first time something had felt wrong on that trip. As they broke camp and prepared to move out, my dad noticed something odd. It was the tracks. Fresh leopard tracks. Right next to his head, where he had been lying the night before. There was no mistaking them. The large, round impressions in the sand, the long, fluid pattern of the paws. They were unmistakably leopard tracks, and they were fresh, too fresh. Whoever, or whatever, it had passed so close to him in the night, close enough for him to hear its breathing and feel its presence. My dad didn't say anything at first. He didn't want to worry the couple. But as they moved out, the weight of what he had felt, and what he had seen, began to sink in. That growl he'd heard, what if it had been a warning? A warning that the leopard had been close, too close, and had chosen to stay hidden in the shadows, just out of reach. What if it had been sizing them up, deciding whether or not to make its move? He never told the couple about the leopard tracks. He didn't want to scare them, and the tracks weren't enough to prove anything. But he knew. Deep down, he knew that he had come far too close to a predator that was far more skilled at surviving in the wild than any of them could ever be. He had heard it, felt it, and it was only because the leopard had decided to let them go that they lived to tell the tale. That's the thing about the wild. It doesn't give you a second chance. If that leopard had wanted to make its move, my dad wouldn't have had time to react. And the couple, lying so close to the edge of that predator's territory, wouldn't have even known what was happening until it was too late.
It was one of those cold, biting evenings in the middle of winter when the world feels more isolated than usual. I was about 7 or 8, just old enough to feel a little confident in the snow, but not enough to handle everything that came with it. We were living on a farm my family was renting, and the place always felt like it had been left behind. The house was old, creaking in places and drafty, but there was something peaceful about it. The fields around the house stretched out, empty and snow-covered for most of the winter. My family didn't own the land. We were renting it from a man who used it to raise cattle. We'd signed up for 4-H, and part of the deal was that we got to take care of some of the steers. The cattle were always out in the fields, far from the house, but we'd get to go out and feed them, clean their pens, and check on them when we could. I remember the cold of the barn, the smell of hay mixed with the sharp tang of cow manure. But even though it was a lot of work, I liked the routine of it. It gave us something to do in the long, dark winter days. That evening, we decided to take my sister's friend out to see the steers. It had been a quiet day, with a thick layer of snow freshly fallen, covering everything in white. The trees looked like dark silhouettes against the pale sky, and everything was muffled under the weight of the snow. The house was quiet except for the creaking of old wood and the occasional snort from the cattle in the barn. My older siblings had a way of doing things faster with less hesitation. They were all a few years older than me, and they never had trouble in the snow. They were tall, and their legs could move through the deep stuff without much effort. But I was smaller, and the snow was deep enough that I had to work harder to keep up with them. We were walking toward the fields, the cold air biting at our skin, and my sister's friend was excited to see the steers. I remember the crunch of our boots in the snow, the way each step felt like it sank a little deeper. We walked for a while, and I could see the cattle in the distance, grazing under the sky. The sun was already starting to set, casting a dim orange glow over everything. The wind cut through the trees, making the snow swirl in small flurries. I kept trying to catch up with my siblings as they joked and laughed, but they kept moving faster and faster, heading toward a field I didn't know as well. It was a shortcut, they said, but I wasn't sure about it. "Slow down," I called out, but my voice got lost in the wind. They didn't seem to hear me, or if they did, they ignored me. They were absorbed in their own conversation, too wrapped up in it to notice that I was struggling to keep up. I couldn't help but feel a bit left behind. It wasn't unusual, but that evening it felt more real. I couldn't shake the feeling that they didn't care. They were so far ahead, already making their way across the field, when the snow suddenly gave way beneath my feet. At first, it didn't make sense. One moment I was walking, trying to keep up, and the next I felt the snow collapse beneath me. It wasn't a smooth fall. It was more like the ground just disappeared. My legs went down and I followed, sinking deeper. I had no idea how far I'd fallen, but the snow piled up around me, quickly reaching my knees, then my chest. My arms flailed out, but there was nothing to grab onto. The snow was dense, almost like quicksand, and it felt like the world was swallowing me up. I didn't panic right away. It felt like a bad dream, like I couldn't make sense of what was happening. The snow packed in tight around me, cold and suffocating. I tried to shout, to call out to my siblings, but my voice didn't seem to reach them. There was no sound except the wind, and the deep silence that followed felt like it was pressing in on me. I could feel my breath quicken, the coldness of the snow creeping into my clothes, my skin. I shouted again, louder this time, but there was no answer. No one was there to hear me, and I started to realize that maybe they hadn't even noticed I was gone. The snow was up to my chin now, and I could feel the weight of it, pushing down on me. The snow wasn't soft and fluffy. It was heavy, packed by the wind, and it was cold enough that I felt my whole body start to stiffen. I tried to move my arms to pull myself up, but it was useless. Every time I moved, more snow filled the space where I had been. The more I struggled, the deeper I seemed to sink. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but it felt like hours. I couldn't hear anything anymore. No voices, no footsteps, no wind. Just the silence of the snow pressing in around me. The cold started to get to me, numbing my fingers, my toes, my nose. It was as if I was fading in and out of awareness, sinking deeper into the snow with every passing moment. I thought about my siblings, about how they had left me behind, how they probably didn't even know I wasn't with them. It felt like I was a million miles away from them, even though I could still see the field where they had been walking, just out of reach. I remember staring up at the sky. The stars were coming out, tiny pinpricks of light in the vast, dark expanse. It was beautiful in a way, but it made me feel even smaller, more alone. It wasn't just the snow that had trapped me. It was the realization that no one was going to come. I might not make it out of this. For what felt like an eternity, I just laid there, staring at the sky, resigned to the idea that I wasn't going to get out. The cold was unbearable, and I could barely move my limbs anymore. I tried to shout again, but the words got lost in the thick, heavy air. There was no one to hear me. There was nothing but the snow, the night, and the stars above. I thought about everything, the house, my parents, my siblings, and I felt a kind of emptiness, like I was slipping away from everything that mattered. But then something inside me shifted. I couldn't give up. I couldn't just let the snow take me. I had to try. I began to push, slowly at first, digging my hands into the snow. It wasn't easy. The snow was packed so tight, and it felt like every move I made only made it harder. But I kept going, one little scrape at a time. I could feel my arms burning with the effort, my body aching from the cold. But I didn't stop. The longer I worked, the more desperate I became. It took a long time, longer than I would have ever thought, but finally, I broke free enough to start pulling myself out. My boots were gone by then. I'd lost them in the snow. The cold was biting into my feet, but I didn't care. I just had to get out. I grabbed onto the barbed wire fence that I knew was nearby, and using it for support, I climbed over it in my socks. I could barely feel my fingers by then, but I made it. I stumbled through the snow, my heart racing, my legs trembling with exhaustion. My feet were numb, my body was stiff, but I kept moving. Every step felt like it might be my last, but I knew I had to get back. I had to get home. The house was still a long way off, but I kept going, through the snow, past the field where the steers were grazing, through the yard until I finally reached the door. My parents were inside, looking at me with confusion. They didn't know how long I had been gone. My siblings hadn't mentioned anything about me getting lost, or that I was stuck in the snow. To them, I had just been playing outside. It wasn't until spring that the landlord came around to fill the hole I had fallen into. He brought my boots with him, both of them, caked in mud and snow. He didn't say much, just explained that he had found it while working on the farm. I didn't say anything either. I didn't have the words. The hole had been covered, but the memory of it lingered, sharp and cold. That was the winter I learned how quickly things can go wrong, and how easily you can get lost, even when you think you're just walking through a field. It was a lesson in survival, in how your body can push past limits, and in the way the world can feel so big and so empty when you're all alone in it. But in the end, I made it. I got out, and that's something I'll never forget. That night at Promontory, everything felt like it was in its place. The cool evening air, the quiet murmur of the river, the laughter of my friends echoing off the trees. 5 of us had come out to fish, and to be honest, we weren't taking it too seriously. We weren't exactly professional anglers. It was just one of those days where the fish didn't matter, and the company and the cold beer did. The night had drawn in quietly, the sun dipping below the horizon as the forest around us began to grow dark. We had been fishing for hours, and with the last rays of sunlight gone, we were now standing next to the truck, talking and laughing like idiots. We were feeling good. We'd been drinking, some of us had been smoking, and the mix of the two made everything feel hazy in that perfect, euphoric way. The kind of good that only comes with good friends, a bit too much to drink, and a successful day of fishing. We had our rods packed up, our gear stashed in the back of the truck, and we were just hanging out by the roadside. The low hum of the trees and the distant sounds of the river seemed to blend into a comfortable background to our conversation. It was around that time we heard it. At first, it was barely noticeable. A faint rumble in the distance, the kind you might dismiss if you weren't paying attention. But we all heard it, and as it grew louder, we couldn't help but focus on it. It sounded strange, like an old clunker of a car struggling to keep up. The engine sputtered, backfiring a couple of times. The thing was loud, louder than any normal car should be, and it was heading toward us, getting closer with every passing second. You could hear every rattle, every pop in the engine. One of us, I think it was Jake, came up with the idea to mess with whoever was in that car. "Let's give him a good ol' moon," he said, grinning like an idiot. We all looked at each other for a second, the alcohol buzzing in our systems, the high of the night setting in, and we just laughed. It was stupid, but it sounded like a good time. The car was coming, and it wasn't like anyone else was around. Just us, the truck, the trees, and this piece of junk car creeping down the road. I don't even know why it felt like a good idea. I guess in that moment, we didn't really think much of it. Maybe it was the alcohol. Maybe it was just being surrounded by the isolation of the place. Whatever the reason, when the car came close enough, Jake dropped his pants, bent over, and gave them a full moon. All of us busted up laughing, watching him from behind the truck as he wiggled his ass at whoever was driving. That's when everything changed. We hadn't expected what happened next. The car was going maybe 40 miles an hour at most, but the moment it passed us, we heard it, the screech of tires on gravel. It was a sound you don't forget. A terrible, high-pitched, metal-on-gravel scream. The car's engine revved, and then it seemed like everything slowed down for a second. The car fishtailed, swerving wildly, the headlights flaring in every direction. It went off the road and into the ditch, the tires kicking up dust and rocks. For a brief moment, all we could do was stare at it, dumbfounded. Then, everything snapped into focus. We all ran. Without a word, without even thinking, we took off toward the ditch. Maybe it was instinct, maybe we just wanted to make sure the guy wasn't hurt, but we started moving fast, all 5 of us. We were shouting, not in panic, but more out of concern. The sound of our shoes hitting the gravel echoed as we ran, and even though we were in the middle of nowhere, there was an eerie quiet that hung over the night, like the whole world had paused to watch what was happening. We got about halfway to the car when we saw him, the driver. He had just opened the door, stepping out onto the gravel, his body silhouette framed by the dim light from the wrecked car. For a second, he just stood there, looking at us. His expression was hard to read, but it was the tone of his voice that hit us like a ton of bricks. When he spoke, it was in a low drawl, thick with an accent I couldn't quite place. He said, "So, y'all like showing your ass, do you?" That's when my stomach dropped. For a moment, I thought he might just be pissed off and yelling. I don't know why, but in my head, I thought maybe we could apologize, explain it was just a joke. But the way he said it, slow and deliberate, made everything feel wrong. Something about the way he stood there, his posture tense, told me this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. Click, click. That sound is something you never forget. It's the kind of sound that makes every hair on your body stand up, the kind that freezes your blood and makes your heart skip a beat. It felt like time stopped for a moment, and I knew instantly that this was no joke anymore. Without thinking, we all turned and ran. We didn't look back. We didn't hesitate. We just ran, our footsteps pounding the ground, our breath coming in ragged gasps as we made our way back to the truck. The gravel seemed to stretch on forever, the distance between us and the car seeming to grow impossibly long. But we didn't stop, not until we were by the truck, the door already open, and we piled in as fast as we could. I don't know if we even slammed the door shut or if we even thought about it. We just sped off. We didn't talk about it much in the truck. We were too shaken up. All of us were silent. The only sound in the cab, the roar of the engine and the hum of the tires on the road as we sped off, our eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror. We drove like we were being chased, like that man was right behind us. And in a way, I guess we felt like we were. We didn't have cell reception for a while, but when we finally got it, we called the cops, gave them the whole story, shaky voices and all. The 911 operator didn't seem all that concerned at first, maybe because we were just a bunch of drunk idiots, but when we explained what had happened, things changed. The operator told us to meet the cops at a nearby convenience store. We parked at the store, watching the road nervously, waiting for the cops. Our nerves were on edge. Every car that came from the direction we'd just come from made us tense up. We jumped every time we saw headlights in the distance. We were too scared to relax, even in the safety of the store parking lot. And then, just as we were starting to think maybe it was all over, we heard another car coming. This time, it wasn't the same guy, but the car slowed as it approached the store, and the driver rolled down his window, waving us over. We didn't know what to expect, but when he started talking, we realized he was another guy who had stopped to help the guy in the wrecked car. He was an army guy wearing a camo jacket and looking like he'd seen more than his fair share of action. He was on leave, he told us, and he said he didn't usually take shit from anyone. But that guy in the wrecked car, he pulled a gun on him too. He was visibly shaken, but he said he hadn't wanted to get involved, but couldn't leave the guy stranded. We didn't know what to say, so we just listened. He said the cops were on their way and that we should stay where we were. When the cops finally showed up, they took our stories, asking us to calm down and explain everything in detail. They told us that the guy in the wrecked car had been arrested earlier that evening for causing a scene at a local bar and was known for having a short temper. The police didn't seem too surprised by the gun. They just told us to go home and forget about it. They took the army guy's statement too and said they'd be handling things from there. We didn't feel great about the situation, but we were glad it was over. The adrenaline started to fade, and we were left feeling like idiots, but also grateful it hadn't turned out worse. That was the day we learned that rednecks can't take a joke, and that they will flip out over the dumbest shit and try to shoot your ass if they think you've wronged them in any way. We never went back to that spot again. That night, we all agreed on one thing. It didn't matter how far out in the woods you were. Sometimes you can't predict just how crazy people can get. Camping was never my mom's favorite thing, but that summer, she didn't have a choice. My uncles were relentless, begging and pleading until my grandma finally caved. They had been talking about it for weeks. Packing lists, fishing gear, firewood, all the things they'd need for a long weekend out in the woods. My mom wasn't as excited. She didn't hate camping, but she preferred the comfort of home. My grandma, on the other hand, had never been a big fan of it. It wasn't that she was afraid of the woods. She grew up with rough summers, plenty of outdoor work, and a stubborn streak that made her immune to the kind of nerves that would make most people hesitate. But she liked structure, control, knowing what was around her. And camping, especially the way my uncles liked to do it, off-trail, deep in the trees, miles away from any paved road, meant letting go of that. The only way she agreed to the trip was under the condition that they'd be careful, and that the dog, Rusty, would be their responsibility. Rusty was a big mutt, mostly German Shepherd, with an independent streak and a deep, chesty bark that made strangers think twice. He wasn't an aggressive dog, but he didn't warm up to people right away. He listened, though, and when my grandma said she didn't want to deal with him on the trip, my uncles promised they'd take care of him. He'd stay with them, he'd be tied up at night, and she wouldn't have to worry about him. That was the deal. And for the first couple of days, it worked out fine. They found a campsite tucked between the trees, not far from a wide, slow-moving creek. The days were long and humid, the nights cool and quiet. They spent their time fishing, hiking, and exploring. My uncles ran wild through the woods, dragging Rusty along with them, letting him chase after chipmunks and splash through the shallows. At night, my grandma made sure the fire was out, the food was packed away, and that Rusty was secured in the truck, away from the smells of whatever animals wandered nearby. It was supposed to be simple. The night it happened, my grandma had been the last one to settle in. The fire had burned down to coals. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, and everything had that deep, peaceful quiet that only the woods can give you. The only thing she remembered before falling asleep was the sound of the water running in the creek. And then later, much later, she woke up. First, she didn't know why. The tent was dark, the air cool. There was no noise, no movement outside, but something felt off. She was groggy, still half asleep, trying to make sense of the feeling. Then, something cold touched her face, a wet nose, pressing against her cheek, sniffing, nudging. Rusty, she groaned, shoving weakly at him, still caught in the haze of sleep. His breath was warm, his nose damp against her skin as he sniffed at her ear, then her jaw. The tent must not have been zipped all the way. "Go on," she muttered, swatting at him. He huffed, shifting back. She felt his weight shift as he backed out of the tent, brushing against the fabric. She didn't think twice about it. She just rolled over, pulling the blanket over her shoulder, and fell back asleep. It wasn't until the morning that she remembered. She had barely opened her eyes when she heard my uncles arguing over the fire, their voices half laughing, half annoyed. She didn't catch what they were saying at first. Her mind was still heavy with sleep. Then something about the dog, Rusty. She sat up, rubbing at her face, and climbed out of the tent, stepping into the cool morning air. The sun was barely up, mist curling low across the ground. She found them standing near the truck, Rusty sitting next to them, ears perked up. She didn't think anything of it at first, not until she saw the way they were looking at her. "The dog," she said. "Did you leave him tied up last night?" My oldest uncle gave her a confused look. "Yeah, he was in the truck all night." The words didn't land right. They didn't make sense. She frowned, glancing at Rusty, then back at my uncles. "No, he wasn't. He got into my tent." Silence. My uncles exchanged looks, then turned back to her, dead serious. "No, he was locked in the truck." My grandma felt her stomach turn. She could still feel it. The weight shifting in the tent, the warm breath, the damp nose on her face. It had been real. It had been something. Something that wasn't Rusty. A heavy silence settled over them, thick and uneasy. Then my mom pointed at the ground. "Look." My grandma followed her gaze. The dirt outside her tent was disturbed, pressed down with tracks that hadn't been there the night before. Not dog tracks, bear tracks. A bear had wandered into the campsite, nosed into her tent, and pressed its cold, wet nose right up against her face. She had swatted at it, told it to go away, and somehow it had listened. Her hands felt numb, her stomach twisted in on itself. They packed up camp that morning. No one argued. No one hesitated. My uncles had wanted that trip more than anything, but as soon as my grandma said they were leaving, they didn't question it. The ride home was quiet. Even years later, she didn't like talking about it. Not because she was afraid, but because of how close she had come to something she didn't understand until it was too late. Because of how close they had all been to something that could have gone so much worse. Because sometimes the scariest things are the ones that don't feel scary until you really think about them. Until you realize just how lucky you were. I still remember that day like it just happened. It was a few years ago, but certain moments stick with you. The way the air felt, the smell of dirt and pine, the sound of tires crunching against the narrow trail cut into the side of the foothill. I can recall every detail. It was mid-morning when my friend and I set out, our bikes loaded in the back of his truck as we drove up a winding gravel road into the hills. The trail we were riding was known for being tough, single-track, narrow, and hugging the side of a steep slope. One wrong move and you could slide a good 10 or 15 feet before catching yourself. It was the kind of trail that kept you focused. No room for error. We parked at the trailhead, a wide clearing with a few other vehicles parked under the trees. I tightened my helmet strap, checked my water bottle, and gave my tires one last squeeze. They were firm. Good to go. My friend did the same, adjusting his pack before swinging a leg over his bike. Without a word, we pushed off into the woods. The first few miles were a steady climb, the kind that burned your legs and made your breath come short. The sun cut through the trees in long golden streaks, warming the dirt beneath us. It was quiet except for the hum of tires over the trail and the occasional chatter of birds in the canopy above. We rode in single file, my friend leading, both of us focused on the winding path ahead. As we climbed higher, the trees thinned, giving way to patches of open hillside. The view stretched out over the valley below, a rolling sea of green with the occasional glint of water from a hidden creek. It was the kind of place that made you forget about everything else. Just you, your bike, and the trail. We hit a section of downhill, a smooth stretch where the trail curved gently back and forth. It was the kind of ride that made all the uphill suffering worth it. I let off the brakes, feeling the wind rush past as I picked up speed. My friend was just ahead, his tires kicking up small clouds of dust as we carved through the turns. Then we hit a climb. It wasn't long, just a short uphill section before the trail curved again. My legs were burning, but I kept pedaling. As we neared the crest, I looked up and froze. A huge German shepherd stood at the top of the hill. The dog was massive, easily over 100 pounds, with a thick coat and strong, sturdy legs. Its ears were up, alert, eyes locked on us. It stood in the center of the trail, unmoving. I skidded to a stop, my tires kicking up dirt. My friend stopped just ahead of me. Neither of us spoke. The dog didn't growl. It didn't bark. It just stood there, watching. My friend reached for his knife, his hand moving slowly. My heart pounded, my fingers gripping the handlebars. Then he did something I didn't expect. He relaxed. "Hey boy," he said, his voice calm. "Seat Mia." The dog's whole demeanor changed in an instant. Its ears perked up, its tail wagged, and then, just like that, it bounded down the trail towards us, tongue hanging out in a big, happy grin. A moment later, a woman appeared over the crest. She was middle-aged, wearing a flannel shirt, jeans, and hiking boots. A large pack was strapped to her back, bulging at the seams. She moved easily down the hill, like she'd walked this trail 1,000 times before. She stopped a few feet away, smiling as she caught her breath. The dog circled back to her, still wagging its tail. Now that it was closer, I noticed it had a small saddle pack strapped to its back, the kind you see on working dogs. She adjusted the straps on her pack, then nodded at us. "You mind doing me a favor?" she asked. We glanced at each other. She explained that she was hiking into an old gold mining site a few miles ahead, packing in food and supplies for a long stay. Her dog had been carrying some of the weight, but he was getting tired. She unbuckled one of the pouches on his pack and pulled out a couple of beers, handing them to us. "Take a few," she said. "Lighten his load." I took one, feeling the cool metal in my hand. It was heavier than I expected. My friend took the other. The woman smiled again, gave the dog a quick scratch behind the ears, and started back up the trail. The dog hesitated for a moment, then followed, trotting at her heels. We watched them disappear around the bend. I looked down at the beer in my hand, felt strangely out of place, cold, heavy, and real. The whole interaction had been so unexpected that it didn't seem quite real. But there it was. We stood there for a moment, the forest silent around us. Then, my friend shrugged, stuffed the can into his pack, and climbed back onto his bike. "Let's go," he said. I followed, pushing down on the pedals. We rode the rest of the trail without stopping, the trees closing in again as we moved deeper into the hills. I kept thinking about that woman, about her dog, about where she was headed. Somewhere out there, past the bend in the trail, was an old gold mining site. I never found out where, and I never saw her again, but I still have that beer can. It was just after my 22nd birthday when everything changed. My parents, who had been living in the same house for years, decided to sell it and move out to the country. They found this old farmhouse, out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by acres of land. There were hills, fields, and woods all around. It was the kind of place that felt like it was too far from civilization, like everything was tucked away. The kind of place people go to get away from everything. I wasn't all that thrilled about the move at first. I had friends in town, and I didn't want to leave my old life behind. But in the end, it wasn't really up to me. I figured I'd just have to deal with it, and maybe I'd get used to the isolation. I wasn't going to stay with them forever. My parents bought the house and immediately started fixing it up. There was a big shed on the property too, a really old one. It was falling apart, but it had potential. I told my parents I'd clean it up and make it my own place. I was getting ready to move out of the house, and the shed seemed like a good spot to have my own space. For a couple of weeks, I worked on it. The place wasn't much, just an old wooden structure with a concrete floor and a small window. It wasn't insulated, so the cold air seeped in from every crack. The smell of old wood, dust, and dampness filled the place. But to be honest, it wasn't so bad. It was a change of pace, and I liked the idea of having my own little retreat. I brought my dog, Max, with me. He was a German Shepherd, my companion for years, and he'd always been good at keeping me company. The shed didn't seem too bad with him there. I started settling in. I had a computer set up, a bed in the corner, and a couple of chairs. It was simple, but it worked. I didn't really go out much. Most of my time was spent in the shed or working around the property. The quietness of the country was something I hadn't really gotten used to yet. At night, when the world outside fell silent, it felt eerie. You could hear every rustle of wind, every crack of a branch. Sometimes I'd lie in bed, listening to the night sounds, and feel like someone or something was out there, just beyond the trees. But I pushed the thought away. I wasn't afraid of the woods. I was bigger, stronger, and nothing was going to mess with me. Then one night, everything changed. It was a clear, chilly evening. The stars above the property were so bright, I couldn't stop looking up. The night felt still, peaceful. Max was asleep at my feet as I sat at the computer, probably wasting time on some random website. But then, out of nowhere, I felt the urge to get up. I had to pee. I stood up, stretched, and glanced out the window of the shed. The night was so quiet, it felt like the world was holding its breath. I opened the door and stepped out, the cold night air hitting my face. The ground was hard beneath my boots, and the grass was brittle with frost. I walked a few steps, then turned away from the shed, looking up at the stars. They were clear, countless, like pinpricks in the black sky. For a moment, I just stood there, lost in the vastness of the night. Then, without warning, I heard it. The shed door slammed behind me. It was a loud, jarring noise. I spun around, my heart racing in my chest. The door had never slammed like that before. It wasn't even windy. I reached out, my hand grabbing the handle to open it, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, my whole body yanking at it, but it felt like the door was locked from the inside. Panic gripped me. I had to get back inside. Max was in there alone. The door was stuck, and I wasn't able to get it open. I pushed again, ramming my full weight into it, but it didn't move. I tried everything I could think of, ramming my shoulder into it, pulling the handle, pushing with my legs, but nothing worked. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the sweat forming on my palms. Max had started barking now, and his barks were sharp and frantic. Something wasn't right. Max was a big dog, and he only barked like that when something was wrong, when he was scared. I tried again to open the door, shoving against it with everything I had. But then, just as suddenly as it started, the barking stopped. There was nothing, no sound at all, just silence. Cold, heavy silence. My stomach twisted. I called out for Max, but there was no response. I felt my heart drop. I wasn't sure why, but I knew something was terribly wrong. I slammed into the door one last time, using all my strength, and the door flew open with a groan. I stumbled inside, half blind from the sudden shift in light. It was pitch black in the shed now. The light was off and I couldn't see a thing. The darkness swallowed the place whole. My mind was racing as I fumbled around, trying to find the switch. My hands were shaking, and my breath came in short gasps. I heard nothing now, not even the usual sound of the house creaking in the night or the wind moving outside. Finally, my fingers found the flashlight. I grabbed it, clicked it on, and pointed it into the blackness. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating everything in its path. I didn't expect what I saw. Max was in the corner, as far away from me as possible. He was crouched down, shaking violently. His eyes were wide and unblinking. He looked terrified. I couldn't understand it. Max had always been a strong dog. He wasn't scared of anything. But there he was, curled up into the smallest ball he could make, trembling like he'd seen a ghost. I took a step forward, my mind still racing, still trying to make sense of everything. As soon as I moved toward him, he jumped, leaping straight into my arms, his body pressing hard against mine. He was still trembling, his heart pounding in his chest. I could feel it against my arm as I held him. He wouldn't stop shaking. "Shh, it's okay," I whispered, even though I wasn't sure if it was really okay. But he wouldn't let go. He pressed himself even closer, and I could feel his fear. Whatever had happened in that shed, it had terrified him. I didn't waste any time. I picked him up, holding him against me as I turned and bolted for the door. I ran out of that shed faster than I ever thought I could. My feet pounded the ground, and my breath was ragged as I pushed myself harder and harder. When I finally made it back to the house, I didn't stop. I didn't even look back at the shed. I just slammed the door shut behind me and sat down on the couch, still holding Max in my arms. I didn't know what had happened. I didn't know why he was so terrified or why I couldn't see anything that would explain it. Max wouldn't go anywhere near the shed after that night. He wouldn't even go close to that part of the property. He wouldn't go outside by himself either. He would wait by the door until I went with him, always looking around, his eyes darting nervously. It wasn't like him. I couldn't bring myself to go back to that shed, either. Every time I thought about it, I remembered the way Max had been shaking, the terror in his eyes, and I just couldn't do it. My parents never really understood. They thought I was being paranoid. They thought I was just spooked by the quiet country life. But I knew what I felt. I knew what Max felt. It wasn't the place for me, and it wasn't the place for Max either. I never set foot in that shed again. And long story short, avoid sheds. I had always enjoyed hiking. There's something about being out in the wild, surrounded by nothing but trees, rocks, and the sound of the wind through the branches that clears your head. So when my girlfriend suggested we hike up the mountain to catch the sunrise, I was all for it. We had been talking about it for a while, and finally the day came. The weather was perfect for an adventure: clear skies, cool temperatures, and the promise of a beautiful view. The trail was a moderate one, not too difficult, but steep enough to make us break a sweat as we made our way up. It was quiet. The only other people on the trail were those coming down, their faces red from the exertion. Some offered friendly waves, but most just focused on their descent, probably eager to get back to the parking lot or home. We smiled, exchanged a few words, and continued on our way, the sound of our boots crunching on the dirt path filling the air. It was getting later in the afternoon when we realized that we hadn't passed anyone in quite some time. The trail was becoming less crowded, and soon enough we found ourselves completely alone. The fading sunlight cast long shadows across the trail, and the quiet was almost comforting. But as the minutes ticked by, I began to notice something that didn't sit right. There was no one else around. We hadn't seen another hiker in ages. Not a single car in the parking lot when we left earlier, either. It was almost as if we were the only two people on the mountain. "Do you think we're going to make it to the top before dark?" my girlfriend asked, her voice a little uncertain. I glanced up at the slope ahead. It was steeper now, and the shadows were growing longer. The sun was low in the sky, and we still had a bit of a climb ahead of us. But I was determined to get to the top, even if we had to make camp there for the night. "We'll make it," I said, trying to sound confident. "We've got time." But we didn't. As we climbed higher, I could feel the chill creeping in. The air was getting colder, and the light was rapidly fading. We both were starting to feel the effects of the long hike, our stomachs growling in protest, and our legs aching from the strain. "I think we should find a spot to camp," she said. "It's getting dark, and I don't want to be stuck on the mountain in the dark." I hesitated. We hadn't reached the summit, but it didn't seem like we had a choice. The trail ahead was getting more treacherous as the light dimmed, and I didn't want to risk pushing too hard and ending up lost in the dark. "Yeah, you're right," I said. "Let's go off the path for a bit and see if we can find a clearing." We turned off the trail, moving through the trees until we found a small, secluded spot that seemed perfect. It was far enough off the main path that no one would accidentally stumble upon us, yet it had a decent view of the valley below. The ground was soft with moss and pine needles, and the air smelled of earth and pine resin. We could still see the last traces of sunlight, the sky fading from gold to deep blue, and the first stars beginning to poke through. We set up camp quickly. The full moon was beginning to rise, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. We didn't even need our lanterns to see as we worked, the pale light from the moon lighting our way. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. There was no sound but the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind, and the crackling of the fire as we sat down to eat. The fire warmed us as we ate, our food simple but satisfying: dried meats, trail mix, and some fruit. As the night wore on, we found ourselves talking about everything and nothing, laughing and enjoying the quiet moments. We didn't have to worry about anything except for each other and the stars above. After a while, we settled into the tent, ready to get some sleep before the sunrise. It must have been around 11 p.m. when we finally drifted off. I remember stirring in the middle of the night, briefly waking to the sound of something outside the tent. A flash, like lightning, lit up the night sky for a brief second, but by the time I blinked my eyes open, it was gone. I thought I heard something, but it was hard to tell. I dismissed it, thinking it was just the wind or my mind playing tricks on me, and fell back into a deep sleep. The next thing I knew, I was being gently shaken awake. My girlfriend's voice was soft, full of excitement. "Hey, wake up. The sun's going to rise soon," she whispered. I rubbed my eyes and glanced around, still groggy. The first thing I noticed was that the ground wasn't wet, though it had been a dry evening. I couldn't explain it, but the earth felt firm beneath me. It was strange. I pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the view ahead. The sky was lightening as we crawled out of the tent. The full moon had set, and the stars were beginning to fade as the horizon brightened. The view from our little clearing was breathtaking. The valley below was dotted with patches of trees, the mountains rising in the distance, and the sky was painted with soft hues of pink and orange as the sun slowly began to rise. I pulled my camera from my bag, eager to capture the moment. It was a sight I would never forget, and I wanted to keep it forever. The colors in the sky were nothing like what I had seen before. It felt magical, like the world was unfolding before us. I snapped a few photos, though I knew the camera could never quite do it justice. We spent the next hour just sitting there, enjoying our breakfast, talking about life, and soaking in the beauty around us. The morning was crisp and clear, the air fresh with the scent of pine and earth. I felt at peace, like the world had stopped for just a moment, allowing us to enjoy everything around us. Eventually, we packed up our things, ready to make the descent back down. We headed toward the car, our footsteps crunching on the dirt trail. The sun had fully risen by then, and the warmth from the day's light was beginning to chase away the chill of the early morning air. It wasn't until we reached the car that my girlfriend asked for my camera. She wanted to look at the pictures we had taken, so I handed it over without a second thought. She started flipping through the photos, a smile on her face as she relived the morning. But then, her smile faded, and I could tell something was wrong. "Look," she whispered, her voice shaky. She handed me the camera and I saw the photo. It wasn't a picture of the sunrise, nor a shot of the beautiful valley. It was a picture of us, both of us sleeping in the tent. We were clearly visible in the photo, our bodies tucked into our sleeping bags, faces relaxed in sleep. Couldn't believe it. Someone had come into our tent while we were asleep, taken the camera out of my bag, and taken a picture of us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't understand. How could someone have gotten so close without us hearing anything? The tent was zipped up tightly when we went to bed. And who would do something like that? The picture wasn't a fluke. It was clear, crisp, and detailed. The only explanation was that someone had been right there, standing over us, watching us sleep. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. There had been no one else on the trail when we camped, no one for miles. We had even made sure to go far off the beaten path, away from the main trail. How could someone have known where to find us? And why? What kind of person would do something so disturbing? I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, and for the first time in hours, I realized just how alone we had been out there. No other hikers had passed by in the dark. No one had ventured into the clearing. And yet, someone had found us. Someone had been close enough to take that picture, to invade our privacy while we were vulnerable. My girlfriend and I didn't speak much after that. The peaceful, idyllic morning had vanished, replaced by a sense of unease and fear that clung to us as we made our way down the mountain. The hike back was silent, both of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to understand what had happened. But the truth was, we would never know who had taken that photo or why. Whoever it was, they had been watching us. And that was something that would stay with me for a long time. We reached the parking lot, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me. We were finally back where it was safe, where we could lock the doors and shut out the outside world. But as I looked back up at the mountain, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that someone had been watching us the entire time. And I couldn't help but wonder, what would have happened if we hadn't made it out of there that morning? I took the job in the bush for the summer, thinking it would be hard work but straightforward. Swing a shovel, take some measurements, do the occasional survey, and enjoy the quiet out in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't glamorous, but I liked the solitude, the steady rhythm of labor, and the feeling of being somewhere so far removed from the world. There were no car horns, no crowds, no distractions. Just me, my gear, and the deep, endless woods. It was the kind of job where you learn to live with discomfort. The early mornings were damp and cold, the afternoons were humid, and the mosquitoes were relentless. I wore layers, but the sweat and dirt still found their way through. My boots were always caked in mud, my hands rough from swinging tools, and my back constantly sore from carrying equipment over uneven ground. But I didn't mind. That morning, I was assigned to redo a survey at one of the cut blocks. It was a familiar location, about an hour's drive down logging roads that twisted through dense forest. The last stretch of the drive was rough, deep ruts, loose gravel, and patches of mud from recent rains. My truck bounced and groaned as I crawled over the worst sections, but eventually, I pulled up at the site. It was a typical cut block, a wide, open scar in the forest where trees had been felled and hauled away. What remained was a chaotic mess of stumps, splintered logs, and piles of broken branches. Some of the debris had been cleared into rough windrows along the edges, but most of it still littered the ground. The place smelled of fresh-cut wood and damp earth, the scent carried by the slight breeze rolling down from the hills. I grabbed my gear, shovel, notepad, flagging tape, and started walking towards the far side of the block where I needed to recheck some markings. The footing was tricky, with loose branches ready to snap underfoot and hidden holes between stumps waiting to twist an ankle. I took my time, watching my step, the morning sun rising behind me, casting long shadows over the slash. As I neared the edge of the cut block, something caught my eye, movement in the trees. I paused, adjusting the strap of my gear, and focused on the spot. A few shapes shifted among the undergrowth, dark and solid against the green. Then, one by one, they emerged. A small herd of moose. I had never seen moose in the wild before. Pictures didn't do justice to their sheer size. Even the smallest one was massive, easily taller than me at the shoulder. They stood just at the tree line, partially obscured by brush, their long legs and heavy bodies framed against the dark trunks. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then, with a shuffle of hooves and a flick of ears, they turned and disappeared into the forest. All except one. One moose lingered at the edge of the trees, standing half in shadow, half in sunlight. It was bigger than the others, its dark brown coat thick and matted in places. No antlers, but it had the build of a bull, thick neck, broad chest, powerful shoulders. Then it called at me. The sound was strange, somewhere between a grunt and a honk, deep and resonant. I wasn't sure what came over me, but I decided to call back. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe excitement, or maybe just stupidity. But I mimicked the sound, doing my best to copy the deep, throaty noise. To my surprise, the moose responded. It took a few steps out of the trees, its ears swiveling forward. Then it honked again, louder this time. I laughed, thinking I had some kind of weird back and forth going with it. So I did it again, trying to match its call. That was my mistake. The moose took another step, then another. Then it started walking straight towards me. At first, I thought it was just curious, but then it picked up speed, its head lowering slightly, muscles shifting under its coat. I suddenly realized I had no idea what I had just said in moose language. Maybe I had challenged it. Maybe I had just unknowingly declared myself a rival. Or worse, maybe I had propositioned it. Whatever the case, it wasn't happy. I backed up a few steps, my boots slipping slightly on loose bark. The moose kept coming. I clapped my hands, thinking the noise might startle it. Nothing. I slapped my shovel against a rock, the metal ringing out. Still nothing. Then it broke into a full charge. I didn't think. I just turned and ran. I don't remember making the decision. 1 second, I was standing there, watching 1,000 pounds of pissed-off moose bearing down on me. The next, I was sprinting for my life, dodging through the logging debris, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The ground was treacherous, loose logs, sharp splinters, unexpected drops between stumps, but fear propelled me forward. My legs burned, my lungs screamed, but I didn't stop. Behind me, I heard the pounding of hooves. It was closing the distance. I pushed harder, barely able to think, just running on pure survival instinct. I wasn't even aiming for my truck at first. I was just trying to put anything between me and the moose. I zigzagged through the slash, hoping the uneven terrain would slow it down. At one point, my boot caught on a branch and I nearly went down. My arms flailed, my balance wavered, but I somehow managed to stay upright. The moose, on the other hand, barely seemed slowed by the mess of debris, its long legs covering ground effortlessly. Then I saw my truck. It was still a good distance away, parked near the treeline where the road ended, but it was my only hope. I forced myself forward, my muscles screaming in protest. The last stretch was the worst. A final open expanse of broken ground with nowhere to hide. I sprinted flat out, the kind of speed I didn't think I was capable of, fueled purely by the knowledge that slowing down meant getting trampled. I reached the truck and dove behind it, barely stopping myself from slamming into the side. My hand fumbled for the door handle, but when I risked a glance back, the moose had stopped. It stood about halfway across the block, breathing heavily, its dark eyes locked on me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, without warning, it snorted, turned, and trotted back toward the trees. I stayed frozen, gripping the truck's side mirror, my entire body shaking. My shirt was soaked with sweat, my chest rising and falling with each ragged breath. My hands trembled as I reached for my keys, still trying to process what had just happened. After a few minutes, I forced myself to open the door and climb inside, locking it out of pure instinct. The moose was long gone, but I wasn't taking any chances. I sat there for a long time, staring at the cut block, my heartbeat still hammering in my ears. Eventually, I started the truck and pulled away, driving slow over the rough road, still trying to steady my breathing. By the time I reached the main logging road, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving me exhausted and sore. My legs ached from the sprint, my lungs burned, and my hands still had a faint tremor. I never made the mistake of calling to a moose again. There was nothing around us for miles, just open land, a stretch of forest, and that ridge in the distance. It was the perfect place for a camping trip, away from everything. No roads, no houses, no lights, just us, our tents, and the fire crackling in the cool night air. The sun had been gone for a while, and the sky was black now, no glow left on the horizon. We sat around the fire, talking, warming our hands, letting the heat soak into our faces. The grass under us was dry and soft, flattened from where we'd been sitting. The air smelled like wood smoke, pine, and the distant scent of damp earth rolling in from the trees. I don't know why I looked up when I did. but my eyes went straight to the ridge. It was maybe 200 feet away, a dark rise against the night. And then I saw it, a shape moving along the top, just a little darker than the sky behind it. Someone walking, no flashlight, no hesitation, just a steady, even pace. I felt my stomach tighten. We were in the middle of nowhere. No roads nearby, no hiking trails. And this person, whoever they were, wasn't wandering or looking around. They weren't carrying a rifle like a hunter, and they weren't dressed in bright clothes like a hiker. They were just moving, straight across at the same pace like they had somewhere to be. For a second, I thought maybe it was a cop coming to tell us to leave. But they didn't stop, didn't turn toward us, didn't do anything but keep walking. I followed them with my eyes, watching their slow, steady path until they reached the far side of the ridge. Then, just like that, they were gone, swallowed by the darkness. I stared for a long time after, waiting, but nothing happened. Eventually, I let myself relax. Maybe it was just some farmer or rancher. Maybe a hiker who knew the area. It was weird, yeah, but not impossible. The fire was burning lower now, and someone mentioned we needed more wood. There were old, dry sticks just inside the tree line, so a few of us grabbed lights and headed over. The moment we stepped into the woods, the air changed. It was colder, the trees blocking out what little warmth the fire gave off. The ground was soft under my feet, covered in fallen pine needles, old leaves, and damp earth. The smell was thicker here, dirt, sap, and that deep, musty scent that comes from wood rotting in the shade. We spread out a little, moving slowly, bending to grab sticks, snapping off dead branches when we found them. My flashlight beam bounced across the trunks, catching glimpses of movement. Just the others, shifting, reaching, their shadows stretching in the glow. Then I heard it, heavy breathing. At first, I thought it was one of the guys. Someone bent over, catching their breath. But it didn't stop. It was steady, deep, like someone exhaling hard after a run. I turned around. Nothing. The sound kept going, deep and slow, somewhere close but impossible to pin down. The hair on my arms stood up. I felt my stomach tighten again, that same cold, creeping feeling from before. Then the guy next to me froze. His flashlight cut through the dark, sweeping over the trees. His breath hitched, and I knew then that he heard it too. The sound was still there, but it was moving, getting farther away. Something was shifting between the trees, just past the edges of our lights. Not a shape, not a person, just movement. A shadow in the spaces between the trunks. The breathing faded as it moved, disappearing into the deep black of the forest. Neither of us said a word. We just stood there, hearts hammering, listening to the silence settle back in. Then we ran. We didn't think, didn't say anything, just turned and sprinted. I don't remember dropping the firewood, but my hands were empty when we burst out of the trees. The fire was still burning, the others sitting around it like nothing had happened. The sight of them, the glow, the normalcy of it all felt unreal after what we just heard. We didn't go back for more wood. The rest of the night felt off after that. I kept looking at the ridge, waiting for another shape to appear. I kept glancing at the tree-line, half expecting to see something just beyond the reach of the fire's glow. We stayed up later than we meant to, no one really wanting to be the first to go to sleep. But eventually, one by one, we climbed into the tents. Lying there in the dark, I listened. The wind moved through the grass, rustling softly. The fire crackled, popping now and then. And beyond that, nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, just silence. I didn't sleep much. By morning, everything felt normal again. The sun was bright, the field open and empty, the ridge quiet and still. There were no footprints leading up to it, no sign that anyone had been there at all. We packed up, made jokes, tried to brush it off. But when I looked back at the ridge one last time before we left, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there, that someone, something had been watching us. And maybe, just maybe, it still was.